There is something beneath the ground in British Columbia that nobody prepared you to know about. Not your history teacher, not your geography textbook, not any documentary you have ever watched on a Saturday afternoon when the rain was coming down and you had nothing better to do than let someone else's voice fill the room. None of those sources ever pointed a finger at the province sitting quietly on Canada's western edge and said, here, right here, beneath these mountains and rivers and ancient cedar forests, something waits that rewrites the story of who we are, something that has been there longer than memory, longer than legend, longer possibly than the oldest human story ever told on this continent. Scientists found it, and when they did, the world did not quite know what to do with the information. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Begin with a question that sounds simple but isn't. What is beneath British Columbia? On the surface, the answer seems obvious. Rock, soil, the roots of some of the oldest trees on the planet. Underground rivers threading their way through limestone formations that took millions of years to carve themselves into existence. Mining geologists know the mineral wealth down there. Seismologists know the fault lines. Environmental scientists know the aquifers. The province has been studied and measured and mapped from above and below for well over a century. And yet, there are places in British Columbia that the maps do not fully explain. There are formations that geologists found and then quietly set aside because the findings did not fit the expected categories. There are tunnels that run deeper and longer and in stranger configurations than the natural geological record of the region should allow. There are chambers connected by passages that follow geometries which, when you spread the survey data across a table and step back and really look at it, do not look accidental. They do not look like the random work of water and time and pressure. They look deliberate. Now, before you decide what you think about that word, deliberate, hold it for a moment. Let it sit there beside everything else you are about to hear. Because the story of what scientists found beneath British Columbia is not a simple story. It is not a single discovery made on a single afternoon by a single researcher who looked up from their notebook and said, there it is. It is a story built from decades of accumulated evidence, from studies that seemed unrelated at the time of their publication, from oral traditions that were dismissed for generations before anyone in a laboratory thought to take them seriously, from satellite imaging that revealed what human eyes walking the surface never could have seen, from ground-penetrating radar surveys commissioned for entirely mundane engineering purposes that returned data nobody knew how to categorize. It is a story that begins, as most important stories do, long before the people who would eventually tell it were born, long before British Columbia had a name at all, long before Canada existed as a country, before European ships anchored in the sheltered harbors of the Pacific coast, before any cartographer sat down to draw the outline of this enormous landscape onto parchment, there were people here. And those people, the indigenous nations whose histories stretch back on this land for thousands upon thousands of years, they knew. They had always known. The knowledge lived in their stories, in their ceremonies, in the careful geography of their sacred sites, in the warnings passed from elder to child about certain places in the mountains where you did not go without preparation, where the earth breathed differently, where something older than any living thing pressed up against the surface of the world from below. The scientists, when they finally arrived with their instruments and their grant funding and their peer-reviewed frameworks for understanding reality, found that the stories had been pointing at something real all along. That is where this journey begins, and it is going to take a long time to tell properly, because the truth of what is beneath British Columbia is not a single thing. It is a layered thing, a braided thing, a thing that keeps revealing new dimensions. The deeper you press into it, the more seriously you take the evidence, the more willing you are to let go of the assumption that the history of this continent began when the first European ships appeared on the horizon. So settle in. The night is long. The questions are deep. And what waits at the bottom of all of this is something that, once you hear it fully, will change the way you look at every map you have ever seen, every history book you have ever opened, every story you were ever told about who discovered what and when and why it matters. It starts in the modern scientific record with a survey that was not supposed to find anything surprising at all. The year was 2003. A team of geologists contracted by a provincial infrastructure project was conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys across a stretch of terrain in the central interior of British Columbia. The purpose was entirely practical. There was a road expansion project in the planning stages, and before any construction could begin, the engineering teams needed subsurface data. They needed to know what the ground was doing down there, whether there were voids that could cause instability, whether the bedrock was where the existing maps said it should be. Standard procedure, the kind of work that gets done hundreds of times a year across Canada without anyone writing a paper about it. The survey team set up their equipment. They ran their transects. The radar pulses went down into the earth and came back carrying information about what they had passed through, and the computers translated that information into images, and the geologists looked at those images, and for a long moment nobody said anything, because the images showed something that did not belong. Beneath approximately 40 meters of soil and fractured limestone, the radar returns were indicating a void space, not a small void, not the kind of irregular pocket that forms naturally in limestone terrain as groundwater slowly dissolves the soluble rock over thousands of years. This was a structured void. It ran in a consistent direction. Its ceiling was at a consistent elevation. Its walls maintained a consistent distance from each other across the entire length of the survey transect. It was, in the language the geologists used in the preliminary report they filed with the Infrastructure Ministry, quote, anomalous subsurface linear feature of undetermined origin, possibly karstic in nature but exhibiting unusual geometric regularity inconsistent with typical karst formation processes. That phrase, unusual geometric regularity, would turn out to be the thread that, once pulled, unraveled an entire fabric of assumptions about what lay beneath this land. The infrastructure project moved ahead. The road was rerouted to avoid the anomalous area, which was standard practice when unexpected subsurface features were encountered. The preliminary report was filed. The survey data was archived, and for several years nothing more happened. But the data was there, sitting in a provincial archive, waiting. It was found by accident, in the way that so many important things are found, by someone who was looking for something else entirely. Her name was Dr. Miriam Calloway, and she was a karst geomorphologist at the University of British Columbia, which means she spent her professional life studying the ways in which water slowly dissolves limestone and creates caves and tunnels and underground drainage systems. She was in the provincial archive looking for historical survey data from a completely different region when a search algorithm, newly implemented by the archive's digital cataloging system, surfaced the 2003 infrastructure report as a potentially relevant document. She read the phrase, unusual geometric regularity, and felt something shift in her understanding of what she thought she knew. She requested the full dataset. It took 3 weeks for the archive to locate and process the physical storage media on which the original radar returns had been saved. When the data finally loaded onto her workstation screen, She sat there for a very long time, looking at what the radar had found, running calculations in her head, cross-referencing the images against her extensive knowledge of karst formation processes in the region. Then she picked up the phone and called two colleagues. One was a structural geologist who specialized in analyzing the mechanical properties of underground spaces. The other was an archaeologist whose research focus was pre-Columbian, indigenous settlement patterns in Western North America. She told them both the same thing. You need to come and look at this. What the three of them found when they gathered around Callaway's workstation at the University of British Columbia and spent an entire weekend going through the survey data together was not what any of them expected. The archaeologist, whose name was Dr. Thomas Riverbend, and who had spent 20 years studying the ways ancient peoples in the Americas had shaped their physical environments, was the first one to say out loud what the other two were thinking, but had not yet committed to putting into words. He said, "This looks worked." Worked. That is the term archaeologists use when a natural feature shows evidence of human modification. When the surface of a stone bears marks that could only have been made by a tool held in a hand. When a cave entrance has been widened in ways that water and time alone cannot account for. When the dimensions of an underground space suggest that someone, at some point, took what nature had partially created and finished the job. The 2003 radar data was showing them an underground tunnel system that stretched for an estimated 3 kilometers beneath the central interior landscape of British Columbia. 3 kilometers of subsurface void space running at a consistent depth, maintaining consistent dimensions, following a course that bent in regular intervals, that had branches extending off the main passage at what appeared to be regular intervals. Callaway had already determined that while the host rock was limestone, and while there was evidence of historical water flow through the system, the actual geometry of the tunnels was not consistent with how water moves through limestone. Water follows the path of least resistance. It finds cracks and weaknesses, and it exploits them, and the result is cave systems that are wonderfully organic and irregular, that twist and narrow and balloon outward, and sometimes simply stop when the geology does not cooperate. Water does not make straight runs. Water does not maintain consistent ceiling heights. Water does not create branch passages that extend at regular geometric intervals from a main trunk. Whatever had made these tunnels had known where it was going. The structural geologist, a quiet and methodical man named Dr. Peter Acheson, spent that weekend analyzing the ceiling structure of the tunnels as revealed in the radar data. In a natural cave, the ceiling is a function of how the rock happened to fracture and dissolve. It can be high or low, smooth or jagged, stable, or prone to collapse. What Acheson found in the radar data was a ceiling geometry that he described in his later paper as vault-like. The ceiling of the main passage maintained a consistent arch profile across the entire 3-kilometer survey transect. Not a perfectly machined arch, not something a modern engineer would produce with precision equipment, but a deliberate approximation of an arch, the kind of shape that someone who understood how to manage compressive forces in rock would choose to create, because an arch distributes the weight of the material above it in a way that keeps the ceiling from collapsing. Whoever had made these tunnels had understood structural engineering. That understanding, expressed in the ceiling geometry of a subsurface passage in British Columbia, was not supposed to exist in the archaeological record of pre-Columbian North America, which was why, when the three of them finally filed their preliminary findings with the British Columbia Provincial Archaeology Office in the spring of 2004, the response was something between careful interest and institutional skepticism. The Provincial Archaeology Office was polite They thanked the researchers for bringing the data to their attention. They noted that the findings were preliminary and that ground truthing, meaning actual physical entry into an examination of the subsurface features, would be necessary before any conclusions could be drawn. They mentioned that access to the area would require consultations with the First Nations communities, whose traditional territories included the survey location. That last point was the one that changed everything, because the First Nations community, whose territory encompassed the survey area, already knew about the tunnels. They had known for a very long time. The Sequepemc people, whose traditional territory covers a vast area of south-central British Columbia, have maintained oral traditions about the landscape they inhabit for generations beyond counting. These traditions are not casual stories told around a fire for entertainment. They are living documents, carefully preserved and transmitted, encoding information about the geography, ecology, history, and sacred significance of the land in forms that can survive for centuries without being written down. When the Provincial Archaeology Office initiated the consultation process with Sequepemc cultural authorities in 2004, one of the first things the cultural liaison officer said after reviewing the survey data that had been shared with the community was something along the lines of, "You are describing the passages that our stories have always talked about." The specific oral tradition that emerged in those consultations, shared with the research team with permission from Sequepemc's cultural authorities, spoke of a network of underground passages in the mountains that had been made, or at least used and possibly enlarged, by a people who were ancient even in the oldest Sequepemc stories. These were not the ancestors of the Sequepemcs themselves, or at least not in any direct lineage that the oral tradition was prepared to claim. They were something older, something that had been in the land before the current order of the world had established itself. The stories referred to these underground spaces in ways that resisted easy translation, because the concepts embedded in the Sequepemc language for describing them did not have clean equivalents in English. But the cultural liaison officer, working carefully with elders and with the research team, arrived at a rough translation that captured something of the meaning. The passages were, in the oral tradition, places where the membrane between the world, as we experience it, and the deeper world beneath it was thin enough to pass through. They were places of knowledge transfer where certain individuals, prepared through specific ceremonial practices, could access information that was not available on the surface. They were places of great age and great power, and they were not to be entered casually or by people who did not know what they were doing. They were also described as connecting in ways that the oral tradition was not entirely explicit about to other places, other passages, other nodes in a network that extended further than any single community's territory could encompass. A network. That word, spoken in the context of a provincial consultation meeting about an unusual infrastructure survey, landed in the room with a weight that nobody present was quite prepared for. Dr. Riverbend, the archaeologist, asked the cultural liaison officer to say more about what the stories described regarding the extent of this network. The answer, translated from the oral tradition, with the care and caution that such translations require, was that the passages known to the Sequepemcs in their territory were understood to be one part of something larger, something that extended to the north and to the south, and possibly to the east as well, something that in the old stories connected places of importance across a vast geography. Riverbend wrote 4 words in his notebook that afternoon, and then he stopped writing and looked out the window for a long time. The 4 words were, "How far does it go?" It would take another 6 years before anyone was in a position to begin answering that question. The gap between the initial 2004 consultations and the next significant phase of research is not a story of bureaucratic delay alone, though there was some of that. It is also a story about what it takes to do this kind of work responsibly. The tunnels, if they were what the preliminary evidence suggested they might be, were located within the traditional territory of a living community with a profound and ongoing relationship to those spaces. Any investigation had to be conducted in genuine partnership with that community, on terms that the community helped to set, serving purposes that the community found meaningful and appropriate. That process takes time. It should take time. The history of archaeology in North America is littered with the wreckage of investigations conducted without that kind of care. Investigations that extracted knowledge and objects from indigenous lands and communities and delivered them to universities and museums without any meaningful return to the people from whose heritage they had been taken. The researchers involved in the British Columbia Tunnel Project were determined not to add another chapter to that history. What emerged from 6 years of dialogue and relationship building was a collaborative research framework that was, at the time it was formally established in 2010, one of the most genuinely co-designed archaeological investigation protocols that had ever been developed in Canada. The Sequipamcy community did not simply grant access. They became partners in defining what the investigation would look for, what it would do with what it found, who would have access to the results, and how the findings would be interpreted and communicated. One of the terms of the partnership was that certain aspects of what was found would remain within the community's custodianship and would not be published in academic journals or discussed in public forums. The researchers agreed to this without hesitation. There are things beneath the mountains of British Columbia that the world at large has not been told, and will not be told, because they belong to the people who have been responsible for them for thousands of years. What was shared publicly, what was written up and submitted to peer review, and eventually published in a series of papers beginning in 2013, was remarkable enough on its own. The investigation team, which by 2010 had grown to include not just Callaway, Riverbend, and Atchison, but also a team of specialists in geoarchaeology, environmental science, physical anthropology, archaeoacoustics, and indigenous history, gained physical access to the tunnel system through an entry point identified by Sequipamcy cultural authorities. They spent 4 field seasons, each lasting several weeks, documenting what they found underground. What they found was this: the tunnel system was real. The 2003 radar data had been accurate. The main passage ran for approximately 3.5 kilometers, beginning in a steep-sided valley and descending gradually through the limestone before leveling out in a large chamber approximately 45 meters below the surface. The passage dimensions were consistent throughout, approximately 2 meters in height, approximately 2.5 meters in width, with the vaulted ceiling profile that Atchison had identified in the radar data. The walls of the main passage showed evidence of modification. The team's geoarchaeologist, a specialist in the microstratigraphy of workstone surfaces, identified tool marks on the walls in multiple locations. Not the broad, crude marks of stone-on-stone percussion, but careful, deliberate marks consistent with the use of tools designed to remove material in controlled amounts. The tool technology suggested by the mark patterns did not match any known archaeological industry from the region in the time periods for which the region had been extensively studied. In other words, the tool marks looked old, older than the accepted chronology of sophisticated stoneworking in the area, old enough that the team's physical anthropologist, when shown the data, immediately asked what the dating was on the work surfaces. The dating was one of the most disorienting things about the whole investigation. Carbon dating of organic material found in the main passage, specifically carbonized plant matter embedded in what appeared to be deliberately prepared sediment layers on the tunnel floor, returned dates that the laboratory ran twice because the first result seemed impossible. The first sample returned a date of approximately 11,000 years before present. The second sample, taken from a different location in the passage, came back at approximately 12,500 years before present. 12,500 years, 11,000 years. Those dates place human activity in the tunnel system right at the boundary, right at the precise transition point between the Pleistocene and the Holocene epochs, right at the end of the last ice age, right at the moment when the massive glaciers that had covered British Columbia for thousands of years were pulling back, retreating northward, exposing land that had not seen open sky in millennia. Right at the moment when, according to the dominant model of North American prehistory, there were not yet enough people on this continent to have done anything as large-scale and organized as modifying a 3.5-kilometer tunnel system in the mountains of what would become British Columbia. That model, the one that said the Americas were populated by people who crossed from Siberia into Alaska roughly 13,000 years ago and gradually spread southward from there, that model was already under pressure from a number of inconvenient archaeological discoveries in various parts of the continent. The British Columbia tunnel system added another kind of pressure, a different kind of evidence that something about the accepted story was not quite right. The team published carefully. They were acutely aware of the implications of what they were reporting, and they were equally aware that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that the evidence, while genuinely compelling, was not yet complete enough to support the most sweeping interpretations that an excited public would immediately reach for. But the paper that appeared in the Journal of Canadian Archaeology in 2013 contained a sentence in its conclusion that circulated across the internet in the weeks after publication, shared and reshared until it reached audiences far beyond the academic community it was originally written for. The sentence read, "The cumulative evidence from the subsurface investigation does not support the conclusion that the tunnel system is a natural formation. The geometry, dimensions, surface modification patterns, and associated material culture, taken together, suggest deliberate construction or extensive modification by human agents, operating in this location at a time significantly earlier than current models of regional prehistory would predict. Deliberate construction, earlier than current models would predict, the world noticed." The reaction to the 2013 paper split, as these things tend to split, along predictable lines. Mainstream archaeologists and anthropologists offered responses ranging from cautious interest to pointed skepticism. The dating evidence, some argued, was insufficiently robust. Organic material in a limestone cave system can be subject to contamination from older carbon sources, a phenomenon called the reservoir effect that can make samples appear older than they actually are. The tool marks, others said, required more rigorous comparative analysis before the conclusion that they represented an unknown technological tradition could stand. The geometric regularity of the tunnel, a third group suggested, might be explicable through geological processes that had not yet been adequately investigated. These were legitimate scientific criticisms. Calloway and her co-authors engaged with each of them seriously, in print and at conferences, because that is how science is supposed to work. They acknowledged the limitations of the dating methodology and committed to additional sampling, using multiple independent techniques. They engaged specialists in surface micromorphology to conduct additional analysis of the tool marks. They commissioned a dedicated geological study of the host rock formation to rule out any plausible natural process that could account for the tunnel's regularity. But while that scientific conversation was playing out in its careful, methodical way, something else was happening simultaneously in other places, in other disciplines, in other archives and databases and remote sensing datasets that had not yet been cross-referenced with what was coming out of British Columbia. People started to look. When a significant anomaly appears in one location, the natural next step for any scientifically minded person is to ask whether similar anomalies exist elsewhere. The British Columbia tunnel system raised a question that nobody had previously thought to ask quite so directly. Were there other subsurface features in Western North America that had been surveyed, documented, filed away, and forgotten because they did not fit the expected categories? The answer, it turned out, was yes. Quite a lot of them. A graduate student in geological sciences at Simon Fraser University, Ora named Chen Wei, spent the better part of 2014 doing a systematic review of provincial and federal survey archives, looking specifically for subsurface anomaly reports that contain language similar to what had appeared in the 2003 infrastructure survey that Callaway had found by accident. He used keyword searches on the digitized records that were available and made direct requests for physical files on records that had not yet been digitized. What he found filled a database that, when he converted it to a summary report, ran to more than 300 pages. Across British Columbia alone, there were 47 separate survey reports filed between 1970 and 2010 that documented subsurface anomalies with characteristics broadly similar to those of the central interior tunnel system. Most were in limestone or similar soluble rock terrain. Most had been categorized as possible karst features of uncertain origin and then essentially set aside. Most had been generated by infrastructure surveys, mineral exploration projects, or environmental assessments whose primary purpose had nothing to do with archaeology. 47 anomalies in one province alone. When Wei extended his search to include survey archives from the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, Alberta, and Washington State, the number grew to 112. 112 documented subsurface anomalies across the western edge of North America, spread across a geographic area from northern Alaska to the Oregon border, sharing characteristics that, when laid out systematically, constituted a pattern far too consistent to be the result of independent natural processes in geologically diverse locations. Wei published his survey review in 2015 as his master's thesis, later condensed and published in a peer-reviewed form in 2016. The thesis did not claim that all 112 anomalies were tunnels of human origin. It made the much more modest and defensible claim that the distribution and characteristics of these anomalies warranted systematic investigation that had not previously been undertaken. But when someone plotted the locations of all 112 anomalies on a map and looked at the resulting pattern, the distribution was not random. It was not random at all. The map that emerged from Wei's survey data showed something that took a while to fully process, because the first instinct when you look at it is to assume you are seeing a coincidence, an artifact of survey density, a reflection of where infrastructure projects had been built, and therefore where ground surveys had been conducted. It took several more months of additional analysis, accounting for survey density and controlling for geological variables, before the pattern could be stated with any confidence. When it could be stated, it looked like this. The 112 anomalies were not evenly distributed across the survey area. They were concentrated along 3 roughly linear corridors. These corridors ran, with some variation and not in perfectly straight lines, but with enough directional consistency to be significant, in a north-south orientation along the western slope of the mountain ranges that form the spine of the Pacific coast. One corridor ran along the western face of the coast mountains of British Columbia. One corridor ran along the eastern face of the same range, in the interior plateau country, and one corridor ran further east still, along the Rocky Mountain foothills. 3 corridors, each one consisting of multiple anomaly locations strung along a north-south axis, each one separated from the others by roughly the width of a major mountain range. The distribution looked, to the researchers who stared at it for the first time in 2015, like a system, like infrastructure, like the remnants of a network of underground passages that had been built, or at least established, across an enormous geographic area by people who had planned on a scale that dwarfed anything the accepted archaeology of the region had previously encountered. The implication was staggering. If even a fraction of the anomalies in the corridors were what the British Columbia Central Interior Tunnel System appeared to be, then somewhere beneath the mountains of western North America there existed the remains of a system of underground passages that might have stretched for thousands of kilometers, connecting communities, or ceremonial sites, or something else entirely across a geography that would have required extraordinary organizational capacity to bridge. The researchers were careful. They continued to be careful in every paper they published, in every conference presentation they made, in every interview they gave to the journalists and documentary filmmakers who began appearing in increasing numbers. They stated clearly and consistently that the evidence was suggestive, not conclusive, that the anomalies in the corridors needed individual investigation before any overall interpretation could be offered, that the organizational and technological capacity implied by a system of this scale would require a complete reconsideration of what pre-Columbian civilization in Western North America looked like. But they were also honest about what the data showed. And what the data showed was a pattern that was very difficult to explain if you started from the assumption that the indigenous peoples of Western North America before European contact had been scattered, small-scale, technologically limited groups who had not built anything permanent, who had not maintained long-distance networks, who had not organized themselves in ways that could have produced something as ambitious as what the tunnel anomaly distribution appeared to represent. That assumption, it was increasingly clear, was wrong, and the more that became clear, the more urgent the question became of where it had come from in the first place. The assumption that the pre-contact indigenous peoples of North America had been living in a kind of eternal and essentially unchanging simplicity, that they had been hunter-gatherers in the most basic sense, lacking the organizational structures or the technological repertoire to build permanent infrastructure or maintain long-distance networks, or create anything that would register as civilization in the sense that European observers of the 19th century used that word. This assumption had been foundational to North American archaeology for most of its history as a discipline. It was not, it must be said, a neutral assumption. It was an assumption that served particular purposes. If the land that Europeans encountered and claimed when they arrived in the Americas had been empty of meaningful human history, empty of achievement worth acknowledging, empty of the kind of deep cultural and civilizational presence that might have given the people who lived there a moral claim to continued possession of their territories, then the dispossession of those people became easier to rationalize. If they had not built anything that mattered, then taking their land had not destroyed anything that mattered. The assumption was never entirely without challenge. Indigenous communities themselves had always known it was false, had maintained through their oral traditions and their cultural practices and their profound knowledge of their own histories, a counter-narrative that spoke of depth and complexity and achievement that the colonial framework steadfastly refused to recognize. And there had been archaeologists and anthropologists, especially from the mid-20th century onward, who had pushed back against the simplest versions of the emptiness narrative, who had documented the complexity of indigenous social organization, the sophistication of indigenous ecological knowledge, the antiquity of indigenous presence on the continent. But the tunnel system changed the terms of the argument in a particular way. It was not testimony. It was not oral tradition. It was not theoretical framework. It was a physical thing beneath the physical ground, a thing that could be measured and dated and analyzed, a thing that, if it was what it appeared to be, represented the kind of large-scale, organized, technically sophisticated construction activity that the dominant narrative had confidently asserted the pre-contact peoples of the region had not been capable of. The argument from silence that had sustained the emptiness narrative for so long, the argument that said if they had built anything significant, we would have found it, was suddenly and visibly flawed. Because here was evidence that significant things had been built, and the reason we had not found them for so long was simply that they were underground, out of sight of the surface surveys that had shaped the archaeological record, waiting in the dark beneath the mountains until someone with the right instrument happened to aim it in the right direction. What else was down there, waiting? The question opened a new phase of investigation that began around 2016 and has continued in various forms to the present. One of the most significant developments in this phase was the systematic application of light detection and ranging technology, more commonly known as LiDAR, to the landscape above the tunnel anomaly corridors. LiDAR uses laser pulses emitted from aircraft to create extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional maps of surface topography. Its great advantage in environments like the forests of British Columbia is that the laser pulses can penetrate through the forest canopy and return data about the actual ground surface beneath the trees, revealing features that are completely invisible to aerial photography or satellite imagery that cannot see through the vegetation. LiDAR had already transformed archaeology in places like the Maya lowlands of Central America, where it had revealed the existence of massive urban landscapes hidden beneath the jungle that traditional ground survey methods had completely missed. The idea of applying it systematically to the landscape of British Columbia, with the specific aim of identifying surface features that might be related to the subsurface anomalies, was proposed by Dr. Callaway's research group in 2015 and funded through a combination of university grants and a contribution from the Secwepemc First Nation community, who recognized that the surface survey data might help them understand features in their landscape that their oral traditions had pointed to for generations. The LiDAR surveys were conducted over 3 seasons, covering a cumulative area of several thousand square kilometers, centered on the central interior anomaly corridor, but extending into adjacent areas as well. The data took months to fully process and analyze. When the analysis was complete, the results added another layer to an already layered story. The LiDAR data revealed, across the survey area, numerous surface features that were inconsistent with the natural landscape formation processes of the region. These features included linear earthworks of varying heights and widths that ran through the forest without any relationship to natural drainage patterns or topographic contours, circular and oval depressions that match in size and configuration, what archaeologists in other contexts had identified as the remains of semi-subterranean dwelling structures, raised platforms of apparently artificial origin at elevated locations with extensive sight lines, and, most intriguingly, a series of features at ground level that aligned precisely with the projected surface, locations of the subsurface tunnel anomalies below. That last finding was the one that crystallized something for the research team. The surface features and the subsurface anomalies were not unrelated. They were part of the same landscape. Whatever had been built or established underground had also left marks on the surface. The underground system had been connected to surface activity in ways that would require, at minimum, extensive additional investigation to understand. The research team stood in the fall of 2017 before a body of evidence that was larger and more complex and more difficult to categorize than anything any of them had anticipated when Callaway had first pulled up that infrastructure survey data on her workstation 14 years earlier. They had a documented tunnel system in the central interior of British Columbia, dated to the end of the last ice age, showing evidence of deliberate human construction or extensive modification. They had a distribution of more than 100 similar anomalies spread across western North America in a pattern suggestive of a network. They had LiDAR, revealed surface features across thousands of square kilometers of British Columbia that correlated with the subsurface anomaly locations. They had oral traditions from indigenous communities that described these underground spaces as part of a larger system with deep roots in a time before current memory. And they had a set of questions that grew larger and more complicated the more thoroughly they tried to answer them. Who built this? When exactly? Why? How? And how far did it actually go? The question of who had built the tunnels was, in some ways, the one most likely to generate the wrong kind of speculation. The internet, by the time the British Columbia findings became widely known through a combination of academic publications and documentary coverage and popular science journalism, had developed a robust appetite for stories about ancient tunnels and the people who might have made them. Some of the theories that circulated in online forums and on fringe archaeology websites were the familiar ones that had attached themselves to similar anomalies in other parts of the world. Visitors from another planet, survivors of a lost technological civilization, time travelers, interdimensional beings. The research team addressed these theories when pressed, with a patience that was clearly sometimes effortful. The evidence did not support any of these interpretations, they said, repeatedly and consistently. The evidence supported the interpretation that human beings, ancient human beings with an organizational capacity and technical knowledge that the existing archaeological record had underestimated, had built these structures. The mystery was not about the humanity of the builders. The mystery was about what kind of human civilization could have organized itself to do this. That was the question that the team's archaeologist Riverbend spent the most time on. It was also the question that took him in the most unexpected direction. The existing archaeological record of Western North America at the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years before present, was dominated by what archaeologists called the Paleo-Indian period. The people of the Paleo-Indian period were understood, in the traditional framework, to be mobile hunter-gatherer bands pursuing large game across landscapes that were still being transformed by the retreat of the glaciers. They were not, in the traditional framework, builders of complex infrastructure. They were not, in the traditional framework, an organized civilization in any sense that would have allowed for the scale of construction implied by the tunnel system and its apparent network of counterparts. Riverbend went looking for ways that traditional framework might be wrong. He found them in places that surprised him. He found them in the genetics literature, where ancient DNA studies were beginning to reveal a picture of population movement and interaction in early North America that was considerably more complex than the simple Bering Strait crossing narrative had suggested. He found them in the environmental science literature, where reconstruction of the landscape of British Columbia at the end of the Ice Age was revealing that the region had been significantly more ecologically rich and diverse during certain periods than the conventional picture of a newly deglaciated landscape had implied. He found them in the anthropological literature, where revisionist work on the social organization of hunter-gatherer societies was challenging the assumption that mobile foraging peoples could not sustain the kind of large-scale coordinated activity that building a network of underground passages would have required. And he found them, most unexpectedly, in the acoustics data. One member of the research team was an archaeoacoustician named Dr. Sarah Drummond, whose specialization was the study of sound properties in ancient built environments. Her previous work had focused primarily on prehistoric structures in Europe, including Neolithic, megalithic monuments, and certain Iron Age structures, where she had documented that the builders had made deliberate acoustic choices, selecting sites and shaping spaces in ways that produced specific sound effects of apparent ceremonial significance. When Drummond entered the central interior tunnel system for the first time in the 2014 field season, she brought with her a set of instruments designed to measure acoustic properties of enclosed spaces: microphones, speakers, data recorders, and software that could analyze the way sound behaved in the space. What she found transformed the investigation in a direction nobody had anticipated. The tunnel resonated, not just in the way any enclosed space resonates when sound is introduced. The tunnel resonated at specific frequencies, in specific patterns, that were not a simple function of its dimensions. The acoustic behavior of the space had been shaped by features of the walls and ceiling that, when Drummond and the team's geoarchaeologist went back and looked at them more carefully, turned out to be deliberate rather than incidental. There were points along the tunnel walls where the rock surface had been modified in ways that created acoustic reflectors, hard, angled surfaces at specific positions that caught sound waves and redirected them in specific directions. There were places where niches had been created in the walls, roughly at head height for a standing person, that functioned as Helmholtz-Itten resonators, amplifying specific frequencies in ways that altered the character of sound in the entire passage. There were points where the ceiling had been shaped to create standing wave patterns that, when sound was introduced at the appropriate frequency, filled the entire length of the tunnel with a kind of distributed resonance, a pervasive hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Drummond measured the resonant frequency of the main passage at approximately 110 hertz. She noted, in her field journal at the time and later in her published paper, that this frequency corresponded closely to the frequencies associated with theta wave activity in the human brain, the brainwave state associated with meditative and trance-like altered states of consciousness. She had documented similar acoustic properties in Neolithic monuments in Malta, in Newgrange, in Ireland, in certain chambered cairns in Scotland. In each case, the conclusion she had reached was the same. The builders of these structures had understood something about the relationship between sound, space, and human consciousness, and they had built that understanding into the physical fabric of their constructed environments. The tunnel system in British Columbia had been built with the same understanding. That finding did several things simultaneously. It supported the conclusion that the tunnels had been constructed rather than naturally formed, because no natural geological process could account for the specific acoustic treatment of the walls. It provided a functional context for the tunnels that was consistent with what the Sequep MC oral tradition had described. These were places where consciousness could be altered, where a different kind of knowing became accessible, where the membrane between the ordinary world and something deeper was thinned by the physical properties of the space itself. And it connected the builders of the British Columbia tunnels to a broader tradition of acoustic architecture that, in the Old World, was associated with sophisticated ceremonial cultures of considerable organizational complexity. The people who had built the tunnels knew about sound. They had built their knowledge into stone, and they had been doing it at the end of the last ice age, in what would become British Columbia, at a time when the standard archaeological model said there was nobody in the region capable of doing anything so deliberately complex. The standard archaeological model was going to need substantial revision. The revision, as revisions of deeply entrenched scientific paradigms tend to go, was not fast, but it began. And as it began, a series of related discoveries in different parts of Western North America started to accumulate in ways that, taken together, built a picture that was becoming increasingly hard to dispute. In 2017, a team working under the auspices of a hereditary chief of one of the Haida nation communities in the Haida-Gwaii archipelago off the northern coast of British Columbia conducted a survey of a sea cave system on one of the outer islands. The cave had been known to Haida people for generations, mentioned in oral traditions as a place of significant cultural and spiritual importance. What the 2017 survey found in the deeper recesses of the cave, beyond the zones that were regularly accessible and had been noted in earlier documentation, were wall surfaces bearing the same kind of careful acoustic modification that Drummond had documented in the central interior tunnel. The Haida cave was separated from the central interior tunnel system by several hundred kilometers and a major mountain range. The techniques of acoustic modification found in both locations were, in the assessment of two independent specialists who reviewed the documentation without knowing where each site was located, consistent enough to suggest either direct communication between the people who made them or a shared tradition transmitted through some channel that the archaeological record had not previously registered. In 2018, researchers in Washington state, prompted by the attention that the British Columbia findings had generated, revisited survey data from a limestone formation in the northeastern part of that state. The data had been collected in the 1990s during an environmental impact assessment for a proposed mining operation. It had identified a subsurface anomaly that had been attributed, without detailed analysis, to a natural cave system. When the Washington team applied the same interpretive framework that the British Columbia research group had developed, they found that the Washington anomaly shared the same characteristics: consistent dimensions, vaulted ceiling geometry, evidence of wall modification, and a location within the eastern anomaly corridor that Way's survey analysis had identified. In 2019, a community-led archaeological project in the Yukon, conducted by members of a First Nations community whose oral tradition spoke of passages in the mountains used by teachers and healers in a time before memory, located and documented a tunnel entrance in a mountainside that had been known to community members for generations but had never been formally investigated. The entrance opened into a passage that, while shorter than the central interior system, shared its key characteristics. And in that same year, 2019, ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in connection with a highway project in northern British Columbia returned data that raised the most unsettling possibility yet. The radar showed not one tunnel, but a junction, a point where two passages intersected, where the single linear feature that the survey had been following divided into two distinct branches running in different directions. A junction implied a network in a way that individual, isolated tunnels did not. Individual, isolated tunnels could theoretically be explained as independent constructions, unrelated to each other despite their similarities. A junction was evidence that whoever had built the passages had designed them to connect, had planned a route and then built it, had created infrastructure that was meant to be traveled through from one place to another. The implications of that possibility, taken seriously, were almost too large to hold in the mind comfortably. What would a pre-contact civilization in Western North America have needed underground passages for? That question occupied the research team through the late 2010s and into the 2020s, and the answers they arrived at, drawing on archaeology and anthropology and ecology and the oral traditions of the indigenous communities they were working with, were not simple ones. The first and most obvious possibility was shelter. The end of the last ice age was a period of climatic volatility of a kind that modern people have no direct experience with. The glaciers were retreating, yes, but their retreat was not smooth and gradual. It was punctuated by sudden collapses and dramatic reversals, by floods of meltwater that could transform landscapes within human generations, by shifts in temperature and precipitation patterns that forced rapid relocations of the plant and animal communities that human populations depended on for survival. In that context, permanent underground shelter, in spaces that maintained a consistent temperature regardless of surface conditions, in locations that were not subject to flooding or the kind of surface disruption that characterized a deglaciated landscape still reorganizing itself, would have been enormously valuable. The tunnels were not cold, dark holes. At 45 meters below the surface in limestone terrain, the temperature would have been consistently around 7 to 8 degrees Celsius year-round, above freezing, below the temperature of summer surface heat, stable in a way that the surface environment was not. As shelter from the kind of climatic extremes that the end of the ice age periodically produced, the tunnels would have been ideal. But shelter alone does not explain the acoustic engineering. Shelter does not explain the careful geometric regularity of the passages. Shelter does not explain the junction points that implied planned routes between locations. Shelter might explain why people use the tunnels. It does not explain why they built them the way they built them. The second possibility, consistent with the oral traditions of the indigenous communities and with what the acoustic research had revealed, was ceremonial and knowledge-related use. The tunnels were places where consciousness could be altered, where specific kinds of experience were facilitated by the physical properties of the space. In oral traditions from multiple communities, they were places of learning in the deepest sense, places where certain individuals went to receive knowledge that was not available through ordinary means. This interpretation connected the tunnels to a much wider global phenomenon that anthropologists and archaeologists had documented across cultures and time periods. The use of caves and underground spaces as sites of ceremonial practice, vision-seeking, initiation, and what we would now call altered state experience. The specific features of the British Columbia tunnels, their acoustic properties, their consistent form, their orientation and spacing, suggested not casual and opportunistic use of natural cave features, but deliberate engineering aimed at creating optimal conditions for specific kinds of experience. The third possibility was infrastructural in a more literal sense. The tunnels as a network of pathways through the mountainous terrain of western North America, connecting communities across a geography that would have been extremely difficult to traverse on the surface during the climatic instability of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. This possibility was the one that implied the most complex social organization, because maintaining and using a network of underground pathways across thousands of kilometers of mountain terrain would have required not just the ability to build the tunnels, but the ability to sustain a social system capable of managing and transmitting knowledge about them, capable of training the people who use them, capable of maintaining the ceremonial and practical protocols that the oral tradition suggested govern their use. The three possibilities were not mutually exclusive. In fact, the most coherent interpretation of everything the research had found was that the tunnel served all three purposes simultaneously, and that this multifunctionality was not a contradiction, but a feature. They were built as shelter for communities navigating a climatically unstable period. They were engineered as ceremonial and knowledge transmission spaces for the practitioners who served those communities, and they were connected to each other in a network that facilitated movement and communication across a vast territory. All three functions were expressions of the same underlying capacity, the capacity of the people who built them to think, at scales, temporal and geographic, that the conventional archaeology had consistently denied them. The conventional archaeology did not simply concede. The debate that unfolded in academic journals and conference rooms and online forums throughout the late 2010s and into the 2020s was vigorous and sometimes heated. Critics raised methodological objections that were sometimes entirely fair and sometimes motivated by something that looked more like an intellectual discomfort with the implications of the findings than by genuine scientific concern. The dating evidence was challenged repeatedly and repeatedly defended with additional sampling and independent methodological approaches. The interpretation of tool marks as evidence of human modification was disputed by researchers who argued for alternative geological explanations, and those arguments were engaged with seriously and, in the judgment of most specialists who reviewed the evidence carefully, found insufficient to account for all of the observed features. The argument that provoked the most sustained debate was about organizational scale. Could people living in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, people whose technology was based on stone and bone and plant fiber, really have organized themselves to build and maintain a network of underground passages spanning thousands of kilometers? The answer that the research team's archaeologist Riverbend developed in a series of papers published between 2018 and 2022 was essentially, we need to stop assuming that organizational complexity requires material wealth, and we need to stop assuming that mobile peoples cannot sustain large-scale long-term projects. His argument drew on a growing body of cross-cultural and cross-temporal research, showing that hunter-gatherer and foraging societies around the world had, under certain conditions, demonstrated organizational capacities that rivaled those of settled agricultural civilizations. The construction of Göbekli Tepe in what is now Turkey, which predated the development of agriculture in the region by centuries, and was built by people whose subsistence economy was entirely based on hunting and gathering, had already forced a major revision of assumptions about what mobile peoples could build. The evidence from British Columbia, Riverbend argued, was another instance of the same pattern. The equation of mobile subsistence with organizational limitation was false, and had always been false, and the archaeological record kept producing examples that demonstrated its falseness, but the assumption persisted because it was doing too much ideological work to be easily dislodged. That argument was not universally accepted, and it was not meant to be. It was an argument offered in good faith, backed by evidence, subject to critique and revision. That is what scientific arguments are, but it was also an argument that resonated beyond the academic community, because it was making a point that many people, particularly people from the indigenous communities, whose histories were at stake in this debate, had been making for a very long time, in different terms, with different kinds of evidence, without receiving the institutional recognition that the argument deserved. The tunnels beneath British Columbia were not just anomalous geological features. They were a reminder of a history that had been there all along, waiting to be found, because the people who were the living inheritors of that history had never stopped knowing about it. By the early 2020s, the investigation of the British Columbia tunnel system and its broader geographic context had become one of the most watched ongoing research programs in North American archaeology. The team that had grown from the original 3 researchers in 2004 now included specialists from a dozen disciplines and partnerships with indigenous communities across British Columbia, the Yukon, Alberta, and Washington State. The research had produced, by that point, a body of evidence that had been reviewed, challenged, contested, defended, and progressively refined over 2 decades. It had produced findings that were solidly enough established to have changed the way many specialists in the relevant fields thought about the pre-contact history of Western North America. And it had produced a set of questions that remained open, that were actively being pursued, and that pointed toward additional discoveries that nobody had yet made. One of those questions was about the full extent of the network. The corridors that Way's 2015 analysis had identified ran north-south along the spine of the mountains, but the oral traditions of multiple indigenous communities suggested that the network was not limited to north-south routes. There were descriptions in traditions from communities in the interior plateau, country, and in the foothills east of the main ranges, of passages that ran east-west, crossing the mountains, rather than running along them, connecting the coastal world to the interior world through routes that the surface terrain would have made extraordinarily difficult to traverse. If east-west passages existed within the same system as the north-south corridors, then the network implied by the total distribution of anomalies would be significantly more extensive than even the most expansive interpretation of Way's corridor analysis had suggested. A targeted survey program to look for east-west anomalies was proposed in 2019. Funding was secured in 2020. The surveys were conducted between 2021 and 2023. The preliminary results of those surveys have not yet been fully published, but what has been shared in conference presentations and in conversations that members of the research team have had with indigenous community partners suggests that the east-west passages do exist, suggests that they are consistent in character with the north-south tunnels, and suggests that the junction points where east-west passages meet north-south corridors are among the most complex and architecturally significant features in the entire system. The world is still waiting for the full publication of those results. The world has been waiting for a long time already, in ways it did not know it was waiting. For 12,000 years, beneath the mountains and forests of British Columbia and the wider western country, something built by human hands has been sitting in the dark. Through the end of the Ice Age, through the rise and fall of the civilizations that those tunnels may have helped support and connect, through the centuries of upheaval and dispossession that followed European arrival, through the decades of archaeological investigation that looked everywhere except underground, through the years of institutional resistance to findings that did not fit the accepted story. It was always there. And now that we know it is there, the work of understanding it is only beginning. There is a particular quality to knowledge that arrives after a very long absence. It does not feel like a new thing learned. It feels like remembering, like something that was always present at the edge of awareness, suggested by the shape of certain questions, implied by the gaps in certain stories, waiting for the right moment and the right instruments to become fully visible. The tunnels beneath British Columbia have that quality. They feel like something that was always about to be found, something that the landscape had been holding in trust for a time when the tools and the frameworks and the relationships existed to receive what they had to offer. What they have to offer is significant, not just in the specific details of their construction and use and age, though those details are significant enough. More significantly, they offer a different way of thinking about what human beings are capable of, about how long we have been capable of it, about the depth and complexity of the histories that have unfolded on this continent and every other continent where people have lived for generations beyond counting. The archaeology of Western North America is being rewritten, slowly and imperfectly, as it is always rewritten, through the accumulation of evidence and argument and the patient revision of assumptions that do not survive contact with the physical reality of what human beings have actually done. The tunnels are part of that rewriting. They are part of the growing body of evidence that the history of this continent before European contact was richer and more complex and more architecturally ambitious than the colonial framework that shaped North American scholarship for 2 centuries was prepared to acknowledge. That richer history belongs first and most fundamentally to the people who have always been its custodians. The indigenous nations of British Columbia and the broader Pacific Northwest have maintained their relationship to these underground spaces and to the knowledge encoded in their oral traditions about them through everything that history has thrown at them. The collaboration between those communities and the research teams that began formally in 2004 has been, in the view of everyone involved, the most essential element of the investigation. Without that collaboration, the data would be incomplete, the interpretation would be impoverished, and the work would be ethically hollow. What the collaboration has produced is a model for how archaeology in the 21st century can be done differently. Not as extraction, not as the appropriation of other people's histories for the benefit of academic institutions that have historically had little concern for those people's well-being, but as genuine partnership, as a shared project of understanding in which the knowledge that lives in community, memory, and the knowledge that emerges from scientific investigation inform and enrich each other. The tunnels are a reminder that the 2 kinds of knowledge were never really separate. The oral traditions that describe the underground passages had been keeping accurate information about their existence for 12,000 years, give or take, long before any university had thought to train a geologist to study limestone cave formation. Processes in British Columbia. The scientific investigation that confirmed what the oral traditions described added something real and important to the collective understanding of these spaces. But it was not replacing something. It was joining something that was already there. That is what the tunnels beneath British Columbia have shown us, most fundamentally. Not just that something old and large and technically sophisticated was built beneath the ground by people whose capacity we had underestimated, but that the knowledge of what was built had never entirely disappeared, had been held carefully and faithfully by the communities whose ancestors had built it, had been waiting, as the tunnels themselves had been waiting, for a time when the world was ready to receive it properly. That time, it seems, is now, or at least it is beginning. The surveys continue, the analyses continue. The conversations between scientists and community knowledge holders continue. The debates in academic journals continue. The questions multiply as the evidence accumulates. And beneath the mountains and forests of western North America, in the limestone and the dark, the passages wait, patient as stone, old as the ice age, full of whatever they still have to tell us whenever we are ready to hear it. Let us go further back, because the story of the tunnels does not begin with the tunnels themselves. It begins with the people who made them. And to understand those people, we need to understand the world they were living in at the end of the last ice age, a world so different from ours that it requires a genuine effort of imagination to inhabit. Even partially, 12,000 years ago, the ice was leaving. That simple sentence contains within it a transformation of almost incomprehensible scale. The Laurentide ice sheet, which had covered most of Canada under a weight of ice, kilometers thick, was retreating northward at a pace of meters per year. The Cordilleran ice sheet, which had buried the mountains of British Columbia under ice that reached in some places to the tops of peaks that now stand exposed to open sky, was doing the same. The land that was uncovered as the ice retreated was not the land we know today. It was raw, scoured, a landscape in the process of becoming, not yet settled, into the forms that 12,000 more years of ecology would eventually produce. And yet people were there, The evidence for human presence in British Columbia at the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene epoch has been accumulating for decades. It comes from caves along the coast that were accessible during the period of lower sea levels, when the continental shelves were exposed as dry land. It comes from the interior plateau, where sites have been found and dated that push the frontier of definitively documented human occupation further and further back toward the Ice Age. It comes from the genetics of living indigenous communities, whose DNA encodes information about population histories that suggest a depth of presence on this land that goes significantly beyond what the surface archaeological record had captured. And now it comes from the tunnels. The people who built or extensively modified the tunnel system in the central interior of British Columbia were living through one of the most dramatic environmental transitions in the history of this continent. They were watching the ice leave. They were moving into landscapes that no human foot had walked before, following the retreating glaciers into new country, learning new ecologies, developing the knowledge systems that would eventually become the sophisticated environmental expertise that later generations would maintain and transmit through thousands of years of oral tradition. They were not starting from nothing. The people who entered British Columbia as the ice retreated were the descendants of populations who had already survived the Ice Age, who had found refuge in ice-free areas along the coast or in interior valleys where the glaciers did not reach, who had maintained their communities and their knowledge systems through tens of thousands of years of climatic extremity. They came into the new landscape equipped with everything that their ancestors' experience had taught them. They came with tools and techniques and social structures and ceremonial traditions that had been refined through uncounted generations of adaptation to challenging conditions. They came, in other words, ready to build. The tunnel system that they created or that they established themselves within and extensively modified was not a project born of desperation. It was a project born of capability, of understanding, of a deep enough relationship with the landscape to know what it offered underground and how to shape that offering into something that would serve their communities across the generations that followed. The oral traditions of the Secwepemc and of other indigenous communities in the region speak, when they speak of the tunnels at all, in terms that make clear that the underground spaces were understood as a gift, not a conquest. The rock was not something to be overcome. It was something to be understood and worked with, shaped with care and respect, maintained in relationship, rather than exploited and abandoned. This distinction matters because it points to something important about the kind of civilization that built the tunnels, a civilization whose relationship to the natural world was fundamentally different from the extractive orientation that has characterized European and post-European industrial cultures. The tunnel builders were not imposing their design on a passive landscape. They were collaborating with the landscape, finding what it offered, and extending and refining that offering in ways that served their purposes without destroying what was already there. The acoustic properties of the tunnels offer a good illustration of this principle. The natural limestone of the region already had specific acoustic characteristics that the builders could have chosen to ignore or simply accepted as they found them. Instead, they worked with those characteristics, refined them, extended them in specific directions that served their ceremonial and knowledge transmission purposes. The result was not a space imposed on the rock, but a space co-created with the rock, in which human intention and natural material had worked together to produce something neither could have achieved alone. That kind of co-creative relationship with the natural world is not a primitive or simple thing. It is, in fact, extraordinarily sophisticated, requiring an intimate knowledge of material properties, a patient understanding of long-term processes, and a willingness to work within the constraints of the physical world rather than against them. It is the kind of sophistication that takes generations to develop and requires careful transmission to maintain. The tunnel system is not just evidence that the people of late Pleistocene and early Holocene British Columbia were capable of large-scale construction. It is evidence that they had developed a philosophy of construction, a way of thinking about the relationship between human intention and natural material that produced results of remarkable elegance and durability. Those results have lasted 12,000 years. The material philosophy that produced them deserves more than a footnote in the history of human thought. There are things about the tunnel system that the research has not yet been able to explain. There is the matter of the sediment layers on the tunnel floor. In multiple locations, the team found what appeared to be deliberately prepared floor surfaces, layers of specific materials arranged in ways that suggested intention rather than accident. Some of these layers included materials that had no local geological source, materials that would have had to be transported to the tunnel location from distances of dozens of kilometers. Why those specific materials were used, what they were for, and how they were transported to their final location in the quantities observed remain unanswered questions. There is the matter of the marks in certain sections of the tunnel walls that are clearly not tool marks, but are clearly not natural features of the rock either. They are organized patterns, geometric in form, of a kind that the team's specialists in symbolic systems and ancient notation have been unable to place within any known tradition. They are not pictographs in the sense that the petroglyphs and pictographs found on rock surfaces across the region are pictographs. They are something else, something that suggests a system of recording or marking that predates the symbolic traditions for which there is currently an archaeological record in this part of the world. There is the matter of the chamber at the deep end of the main passage. The large room approximately 45 meters below the surface, where the main passage levels out and widens, has features that the team has not finished analyzing. The ceiling of the chamber is shaped in a way that is different from the ceiling of the passage leading to it. The walls of the chamber have been treated in specific ways that go beyond the acoustic modifications observed elsewhere, and in the floor of the chamber there are features described carefully and respectfully in the team's documentation that the indigenous community partners have asked not to be described in detail in public-facing communications. Some things about this place remain appropriately within the custodianship of the people who have been responsible for it for longer than anyone can measure. There is the matter of what the east-west surveys found at the junction points, the places where east-west passages meet north-south corridors. The research team has said enough in conference presentations to make clear that the junction points are architecturally complex and historically significant. The full publication of what they found there is awaited by everyone who has been following this story. And there is the matter of the other sites, the ones that have been identified through remote sensing but not yet physically investigated, spread across the corridors that Ways ALEM analysis documented and the junction areas that the east-west surveys have begun to reveal. Each of those sites is a question waiting to become an answer. Each one might add something new and unexpected to the picture, or might confirm what is already emerging, or might reveal something that changes the entire framework of interpretation. Yet again, the investigation is not complete. It may not be complete for decades. The questions it has raised are large enough and important enough to sustain research programs that will outlast everyone currently involved in them. But the core findings are solid. The tunnels are real. They are old. They are human-made. They are part of something larger than any individual site, and they come from a history that is richer and deeper and more complex than the story we had been telling about this continent. What does it mean to find out that the history you were taught was incomplete in ways this significant? That question is not just an abstract philosophical one. It has practical dimensions. It has political dimensions. It has implications for how we understand the present as well as the past. The story of North American prehistory that dominated scholarship for most of the 20th century was, as we noted earlier, not a neutral story. It was a story that served specific interests and enabled specific conclusions about the legitimacy of colonial possession of indigenous lands. If the people who had lived on those lands for thousands of years before European arrival had not built anything permanent, had not established complex social organization, had not maintained large-scale networks, had not created civilization in any recognizable sense, then the dispossession of those people could be framed as the arrival of history in a place that had previously existed outside of history. The tunnels beneath British Columbia are a direct challenge to that framing. They are evidence of permanence, evidence of complexity, evidence of large-scale organization, evidence of civilization, not in the narrowly architectural or political sense that colonial frameworks typically used when deciding which peoples deserve to be treated as civilized, but in the deeper sense of a sophisticated and sustainable way of living in relationship with the physical world over very long periods of time. That evidence does not resolve on its own the political and legal questions about indigenous sovereignty and rights that are actively contested in British Columbia and across Canada. Those questions have their own processes, their own complexity, their own timeline, but it changes the terms of the conversation in ways that matter. It makes certain dismissive arguments harder to sustain. It makes certain silences harder to maintain. The SEC-WEPMC cultural liaison officer who told the research team in that 2004 consultation meeting that the underground features they had found were the passages the community's stories had always talked about was not surprised by the discovery. She was, in a sense, confirming it. The knowledge of what was there had never been lost from the community. What was new was that the broader world was finally in a position to receive it. That is a dynamic that repeats itself across the story of the British Columbia tunnel investigation. The scientists who found the tunnels, the researchers who analyzed them, the scholars who wrote about them, were joining a conversation that had been going on for 12,000 years in their absence. They brought instruments and analytical frameworks that added something real and useful to the conversation. But they were latecomers, and the appropriate posture for a latecomer is one of gratitude and humility, not one of ownership. The tunnels are not a discovery in the colonial sense of that word. They were not unknown. They were known, deeply known, by the people who had been responsible for them since they were built. What changed in 2003, when the infrastructure survey returned its anomalous radar data, was not the status of the tunnels from unknown to known. What changed was the form of the evidence about them, from oral and ceremonial knowledge that the dominant institutions did not recognize as knowledge, to technical, scientific data that those institutions were equipped to process and take seriously. That change is significant, but it should be held carefully, with awareness of what it represents. Not a discovery, but a translation. A translation of knowledge from one form into another, from the form in which it had been held for 12,000 years into a form that a particular set of 21st century institutions can engage with. The translation is valuable. The original is irreplaceable. There is one more thread in this story that has not yet been fully pulled, a thread that connects the British Columbia tunnels to something even larger than the regional picture that the anomaly quarter analysis revealed. Beginning in 2020, Dr. Riverbend began corresponding with researchers in other parts of the Americas who were working on findings that bore striking similarities to what had emerged from the British Columbia investigation. The correspondents were a diverse group: an archaeologist in Peru who had been documenting subsurface anomalies in the Andes highlands for years without finding a framework for interpreting them, a geologist in Mexico who had been collecting data on unusual cave formations in the limestone karst of the Yucatan Peninsula that shared characteristics with what had been found in British Columbia, a team in the Appalachian region of the eastern United States who had documented an anomaly distribution that resembled, at a different geographic scale, the corridor pattern that Way had identified in the West. None of these researchers had been in contact with each other before Riverbend began making connections. Each of them was working, largely in isolation, with data that they had found difficult to interpret within existing frameworks because the frameworks had not been built to accommodate what they were finding. When Riverbend brought them together, first in correspondence and then in a workshop held at the University of British Columbia in 2021, they found something remarkable. The anomalies they were each describing, separated by thousands of kilometers, separated by different geological settings and different cultural contexts and different research histories, shared a set of core characteristics that was, by any reasonable standard of assessment, too consistent to be coincidental. The workshop produced a position paper that circulated among specialists for about a year before being published in a special issue of the Journal of World Prehistory in 2022. The paper did not claim to have solved any of the mysteries that the individual research programs had raised. It claimed something more modest and more important: that the mysteries were related, that the anomalies documented across the Americas were likely different parts of a single larger phenomenon, that the organizational and technical capacity implied by the individual findings, already remarkable in isolation, became even more remarkable when the continental scale of the distribution was taken into account. The paper proposed a term for the phenomenon it was describing: continental subsurface cultural architecture. It was an awkward term, the kind of term that gets coined when existing vocabulary is insufficient, and the researchers acknowledged that it was provisional, likely to be revised as the research developed. But it captured something important: the idea that what had been found was not a collection of individual anomalies, but a dimension of pre-contact American civilization that had been entirely invisible to the existing archaeological record because it was underground. A dimension of pre-contact American civilization. The phrase is carefully chosen. It does not specify what kind of civilization. It does not claim a single unified culture spanning two continents. It acknowledges that the underground architectural tradition expressed itself differently in different places, in response to different geological settings, different cultural contexts, different functional needs. But it asserts that this tradition was a real thing, that it existed, that it was widespread, and that its existence requires a fundamental revision of the story we tell about the human history of the Americas. That revision is underway. It is not complete. It will not be complete in the lifetimes of the researchers who are currently pursuing it. But it has begun, and what has been found already is enough to say, with confidence, that the world that existed beneath the mountains of British Columbia 12,000 years ago was larger and more deliberate and more deeply connected than anything we had previously imagined. The tunnels knew that all along. There is something that happens to you when you stand in a space that is 12,000 years old and human-made and underground. The researchers who have been in the central interior tunnel system describe it consistently across different personalities and different disciplinary backgrounds in similar terms: There is a quality of stillness in the space that is not simply the absence of surface sound. It is something more active than that. The rock holds a particular kind of silence that feels inhabited, that carries within it some quality of all the time that has passed since the last person stood where you are standing. Dr. Drummond, the archaeoacoustician, describes her first time in the tunnel in terms of what she calls acoustic arrival, the moment when you step into a resonant space and the space acknowledges your presence by wrapping around your sound. Every sound you make, the scuff of your boot, the brush of your hand against the wall, your own breath, returns to you slightly changed, slightly amplified in specific frequencies, embedded in the resonance of the space. You are heard in the tunnel. You are heard in a way that the surface world does not hear you. The space pays attention. That experience of being heard by a 12,000-year-old engineered space is not a small thing. It is a reminder that the people who built this place understood something about human experience that translated across the enormous gulf of time between their moment and ours. They knew that people needed sometimes to be in a space that acknowledged their presence. They built that acknowledgement into the physics of the tunnel, into the geometry of the walls and the curve of the ceiling. And it still works. 12,000 years later, the walls still hear you. There is a kind of continuity in that. Not sentimental continuity, not the comfortable illusion that the past and present are simply connected by a long thread of unchanging human nature. A more specific continuity, the continuity of a designed acoustic environment whose properties were calculated by people who understood sound and space, whose calculations were accurate, and whose work has endured. The people who built the tunnels are gone, in the sense that the individuals are gone, that the specific communities of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene no longer exist in their original forms. But they are not gone in the sense that their descendants are gone, because the indigenous peoples of British Columbia and the wider Pacific Northwest are those descendants, living and present and actively engaged in the ongoing story of what the tunnels mean and who they belong to, and what the world should do with the knowledge of their existence. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to as the long story of the British Columbia tunnel system continues to unfold. This is not a story about the past. It is a story about a past that has been living in the present all along, in the oral traditions and ceremonial practices and ecological knowledge of communities whose connection to this landscape is unbroken, however much colonial history tried to break it. The scientists found the tunnels. The tunnels were already known. The world was shocked. The communities whose ancestors built the tunnels were not shocked, were something more like vindicated, were something more like recognized after a very long wait. The recognition is overdue, but it is here now. And what it opens up in terms of how we understand the history of this continent and the history of what human beings are capable of is a horizon that keeps extending the further you walk toward it. Perhaps we should talk about what the tunnels are not, because in the years since the findings became publicly known, a considerable amount of what has been written and said about them in popular media has been wrong in specific and predictable ways. The tunnels are not evidence of a lost civilization that was technologically advanced in the science fiction sense. There are no mysterious energy sources. There are no machines. There are no artifacts of the kind that would suggest access to technology that was fundamentally different in kind from what we know human beings to have been capable of at the end of the Ice Age. The construction of the tunnels required skill, knowledge, coordination, and sustained effort on a large scale. It did not require anything that we cannot account for within the framework of what human beings can achieve with Stone Age tools and a sophisticated understanding of geology and acoustics. The tunnels are not evidence of alien visitation. This point should not need to be made, but it does need to be made, because the popular appetite for alien intervention in ancient archaeology has produced a substantial body of speculation connecting the British Columbia findings to extraterrestrial activity. The research team has addressed this consistently. The evidence supports the interpretation that human beings built these tunnels, using methods consistent with the technological traditions of late Pleistocene North America. There is no need to invoke non-human agency. The human agency is remarkable enough. The tunnels are not evidence of a single unified civilization spanning the entire Western Hemisphere. The Continental Subsurface Cultural Architecture position paper was careful to specify that the anomalies documented across the Americas likely represent related but distinct traditions, not a single monolithic culture. The similarities between finds in British Columbia and finds in Peru and finds in the Appalachians suggest communication, exchange, shared tradition, possibly common origin. They do not require the existence of an Atlantis-like empire stretching from pole to pole. What the tunnels are evidence of is harder to sensationalize but more genuinely remarkable than any of the sensational interpretations. They are evidence that the pre-contact peoples of North America were capable of organizing themselves across vast geographic scales, maintaining shared traditions across thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, engineering solutions to physical and experiential challenges that required sophisticated understanding of materials and sound and space, and creating infrastructure of a durability that has outlasted every civilization that has risen and fallen since they built it. That is the actual story. It is not a story that requires aliens or lost continents or science fiction technology. It is a story about what human beings can do when they are organized and knowledgeable and operating within a relationship with the natural world that is collaborative rather than extractive. It is a story about the depth and richness of the history of this continent and about the communities who have maintained their connection to that history across every challenge that history has thrown at them. It is a story worth telling carefully because it is true. The mountains of British Columbia look different when you know what is beneath them. From the surface, they are spectacular in the way that the mountains of the Pacific Northwest are always spectacular, vast, forested, snow-capped above the tree line, threaded by rivers whose clarity in autumn turns them the color of jade. The landscape does not advertise what it contains. It does not need to. It has been keeping its secrets for 12,000 years, and it is in no hurry to give them all up at once. But when you know what the ground-penetrating radar found in 2003, when you have read the dating reports and the acoustic analyses and the tool mark studies and the LiDAR data and the oral tradition documentation, the landscape changes in your perception. The valleys and ridgelines start to read differently. The places where the oral traditions locate significant underground features, when you cross-reference them with the anomaly, corridor maps begin to suggest a geography that runs deeper than the visible surface. You start to see the landscape as the people who built the tunnels might have seen it, not as a collection of obstacles and resources to be navigated, but as a living system with a depth that extends below the surface into chambers and passages where something important could happen, where knowledge could be transmitted and sustained across the generations. That shift in perception is, in a modest way, what the tunnels are offering the broader world in the 21st century. Not just the specific historical and archaeological knowledge of what was found, and when, and what it implies about pre-contact civilization in Western North America, but a different way of looking at the landscape, a way of looking that takes seriously the depth of the past and the depth of the ground, that doesn't assume the story begins at the surface, that is willing to go down into the dark and find out what is there. The tunnels went down. The people who built them understood that the depth held something worth finding, worth shaping, worth maintaining, for the generations that would come after. They were right about that. They have been right about it for 12,000 years. The generations that have come after, including the ones alive right now, are still finding out how right they were. As this story comes toward its end, or toward the end of what can be said here, in this telling, at this moment, when so much of the investigation is ongoing and so many of the most significant findings are still being processed and analyzed and discussed, it seems worth returning to the beginning. The beginning is a question that sounded simple, but wasn't. What is beneath British Columbia? The answer, as we have seen, is larger than anyone expected. Larger than the infrastructure surveyors who returned the anomalous radar data in 2003 could have guessed. Larger than Callaway and Riverbend and Atchison imagined when they gathered around a workstation in 2004 and started asking each other whether the data could mean what it appeared to mean. Larger than the framework of North American archaeology had been prepared to accommodate. What is beneath British Columbia is a network of underground passages built by human beings at the end of the last ice age. Passages that were engineered with a sophistication that current models of pre-contact civilization in the region had no place for. Passages that were used for purposes that oral traditions spanning thousands of years have described, and that the physical evidence of their acoustic and architectural properties supports. Passages that are part of something larger, a continental tradition of subsurface cultural architecture whose full extent and meaning the research community is still working to understand. What is beneath British Columbia is also the knowledge of those passages held in unbroken continuity by the indigenous communities whose ancestors built them and whose descendants are alive and active today, collaborating with researchers to ensure that the story of what is underground is told with accuracy and with respect for the people whose story it primarily is. And what is beneath British Columbia, perhaps most importantly, is a reminder that the story of what human beings are and what we have done and what we are capable of is longer and deeper and more varied than the narrow slice of that story that gets called history can contain. A reminder that the land holds knowledge in ways that the surface cannot show, and that the communities who have maintained their relationship to that knowledge through everything that colonial history did to disrupt it have been custodians of something irreplaceable. A reminder that when scientists find something that shocks the entire world, the world that is shocked is usually a world that had been looking in the wrong direction. The right direction, as it turns out, is down through the limestone of the interior plateau, down past the water table, past the karst formations that develop naturally and the ones that do not, down to the level where the temperature is constant and the acoustics are deliberate and the ceiling curves. In an arch that someone calculated and cut and smoothed 12,000 years ago, so that the weight of the mountain above it would distribute itself in ways that kept the passage open, down to where the walls still hear you when you speak, down to where the story of this land and these people and this continent begins, in the darkness of a passage that has been waiting, patiently and without hurry, for the world above it to be ready. The world is not quite ready, but it is beginning, and that is enough for now. For the tunnels. They have been waiting for 12,000 years. They can wait a little longer for the rest of the story to catch up. Drift now, if you're ready to drift. The mountains are dark outside, wherever you are. The ground beneath whatever city or town or wilderness you are lying in holds its own depths, its own history, its own long memory of everything that has passed above it. Below every landscape is another landscape, older and quieter. Below every history is another history, longer and stranger. Below every story we have been told about who lived here and what they built and what they left behind is a truer story, more complex and more human and more worth knowing. The tunnels beneath British Columbia are part of that truer story, and the people who built them, and the people who remembered them, and the people who are spending their careers trying to understand them properly are all part of the same long human project, the project of knowing where we came from and honoring the depth of what was here before us and carrying forward the knowledge that was entrusted to us by everyone who came before. Rest now. The investigation continues without you, as it has always continued, in laboratories and archives and underground passages and the long memories of communities who have never lost the thread. You will wake up in a world that is still finding out what is beneath its feet. That is a good kind of world to wake up in. End of script. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to underground spaces, not the silence of a quiet room where the absence of sound is simply the absence of sound, not the silence of a forest at night where the hush between sounds carries its own texture of rustling and distant water and the breath of wind through leaves. The silence of a tunnel carved into limestone 12,000 years ago is something different from either of those. It is a silence with weight, a silence that presses on the eardrums in a way that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breath, the slight rush of blood through the vessels in your ears. It is a silence that makes the body suddenly audible to itself. The researchers who spent weeks at a time in the central interior tunnel system during the field seasons between 2010 and 2018 describe this quality of silence in ways that vary in their vocabulary but converge on the same essential experience. It is not frightening, they say, though the first encounter with it can be startling. After the initial adjustment, it becomes something else. Something that one researcher, in a paper that is primarily about acoustic measurement techniques and only peripherally about the phenomenology of the experience, described in a single parenthetical sentence as deeply familiar, in the way that certain dreams feel deeply familiar even when their content is entirely new. Deeply familiar. That phrase stuck with other members of the team when they read it, because each of them recognized what it was pointing at. There is something about the silence of the tunnel that the human nervous system seems to know, not intellectually, not through any conscious recognition, but at a level below conscious recognition, a level where the body has its own knowledge that predates anything the mind has learned. This should not be surprising, given what we know about the acoustic engineering of the space. If the tunnel was built, as the evidence suggests it was, specifically to facilitate altered states of consciousness through the acoustic properties of its enclosed volume, then the human nervous system's recognition of that specific quality of silence is not mysterious at all. It is the nervous system doing exactly what the builders designed it to do, responding to a set of physical stimuli that the builders had calculated and constructed across 12,000 years of time, with the same effect they had always produced. The tunnel still works. That is the thing that is hardest to hold in the mind. The tunnel still works, and the human nervous system, encountering it for the first time in the 21st century, still responds the way the builders of the tunnel intended it to respond. Something crosses the 12,000-year gap between the intentions of the builders and the experience of the present-day researchers. Something that has nothing to do with language or record or any of the usual channels through which one moment's knowledge is transmitted to another moment. Far in the future, the architecture transmits it, the shape of the space, the curves of the walls, the angle of the ceiling, the specific placement of the acoustic reflectors, and the resonating niches. These physical facts are the record. The knowledge they encode does not decay the way written records decay, or fade the way oral traditions can fade across very long periods, or disappear the way wooden structures disappear into compost. It is encoded in stone, in the shape of cut limestone, and stone endures. The builders knew that stone endures. They built what they built in stone precisely because they understood that they were building for the long run, for the generations that would come after, in numbers they could not predict, and across time spans that outreached any individual's ability to imagine. They were building for the 12th year as much as for the first. They were building for the 21st century researcher who would one day step into the passage and feel the deep, familiar silence settle around them and know, without knowing how they knew, that they were in a place that had always been meant for this moment of encounter. The question of intentionality in ancient construction is one that archaeologists and philosophers of archaeology have debated for a long time, and it deserves a moment's careful attention here because it matters for how we understand the tunnels. When we say that the builders intended the tunnels to produce specific acoustic effects, we are making a claim about the mental states of people who lived 12,000 years ago and left no written record of their intentions. How can we know what they intended? Isn't it possible that the acoustic properties are incidental, that the builders were focused on the structural and functional aspects of the space, and the sound effects simply emerged as byproducts of the geometry they chose for other reasons? This is a fair question, and it deserves a fair answer. The answer is that the acoustic features of the tunnel are not incidental. They are not byproducts of structural choices made for other reasons. The specific modifications to the walls, the placement of the reflective surfaces, the positioning of the resonating niches at head height for a standing person, the shaping of the ceiling to create standing wave patterns, all of these features would have required additional labor that served no structural purpose. The structural integrity of the tunnel could have been maintained without any of them. The only function they serve is acoustic. The only reason to include them in the construction is if you are deliberately shaping the acoustic properties of the space. The evidence of deliberate acoustic engineering is, in the technical assessment of the specialists who have examined it, as clear as the evidence of deliberate structural engineering. Both are present, both are the product of knowledge and intention applied to the physical material of the rock. When we say the builders intended the acoustic effects, we are therefore making a claim that the evidence supports. We are not speculating about unknowable mental states. We are reading physical evidence in the same way that we read the physical evidence of structural design as the product of a human mind that understood what it wanted to achieve and knew how to achieve it. What the builders wanted to achieve acoustically was a space that altered consciousness, a space where the physical properties of sound in an enclosed volume would produce effects in the human nervous system that facilitated specific kinds of experience that their cultural and ceremonial traditions valued and that their social organization had created roles for. They built that space, they built it skillfully, and they built it in stone so that it would outlast everything else about their civilization, so that it would be there for the people who came after, for as long as the rock itself endured. The rock is still there. The effect is still there. The intention, encoded in the curve of the ceiling and the placement of the reflecting surfaces, is still there. When Riverbend first proposed, in a paper circulated for peer review in 2019, that the tunnel system might best be understood as a form of what he called embodied cultural transmission, the idea was met with the mixture of interest and skepticism that genuinely new conceptual frameworks typically receive in academic contexts. The concept of embodied cultural transmission was Riverbend's attempt to articulate what was distinctive about the way the tunnels transmitted knowledge across time. Traditional models of cultural transmission focus on explicit records, oral traditions, written texts, visual symbols, material objects whose cultural significance is carried in social memory rather than in the objects themselves. All of these modes of transmission are dependent on the continuity of the social context that gives them meaning. If the community that knows the stories dies, the stories die. If the society that can read the text dissolves, the texts become unreadable. If the memory of what the objects mean is lost, the objects become mere artifacts, stripped of the knowledge they were meant to carry. Embodied cultural transmission, as Riverbend defined it, is different. It is knowledge encoded not in symbolic form, but in physical form, in the specific properties of constructed environments that produce specific effects in the human body and nervous system when those environments are encountered. The knowledge is not dependent on social memory for its transmission because it does not require a receiver who has been pre-told what to expect. The environment produces the effect directly. The body receives the knowledge directly. The cultural significance of the experience, the interpretation of what the altered state of consciousness means, and how it should be integrated into daily and ceremonial life, that does require social context. But the experience itself, the thing that the cultural significance is built around, is transmitted by the physical structure of the space. This is why the 21st century researchers who enter the tunnel feel what they feel. They have not been prepared by any social or cultural tradition to expect what happens when they step into the space. They encounter it without preconditioning, and the space works on them anyway. The body responds to the physical stimuli as the body was designed to respond, and the experience that results is recognizable across 12,000 years as the kind of experience that the builders were building for. The implication, if Riverbend's framework is correct, is that the tunnels are a form of cultural knowledge that does not require an unbroken chain of explicit social transmission to survive. The knowledge is encoded in the stone. It waits. And when someone enters the space with sufficient openness to receive what it is offering, the knowledge transmits itself directly, body to body, across whatever gap in time separates the builder from the receiver. That is a remarkable thing to propose. It is also, given the evidence of the acoustic engineering and the physiological responses of the researchers who have worked in the tunnel, a reasonable thing to propose. The idea that ancient peoples were capable of encoding knowledge in built environments in ways that could outlast any explicit social record is not in principle implausible. We already accept that they were capable of encoding structural knowledge in built environments. The arch that keeps the ceiling up is a form of encoded knowledge, accessible to any engineer who understands how arches work, regardless of whether they know the history of the specific arch they are examining. Riverbend is proposing that the tunnel builders extended this same principle to acoustic and experiential knowledge, that they understood how to encode specific experiential effects in the physical properties of enclosed spaces, and that they built those encodings into the rock specifically so that the knowledge would survive. Whether or not the formal concept of embodied cultural transmission achieves the kind of uptake in archaeological theory that its proposer hopes for, the underlying observation it is built on stands. The tunnel works. The knowledge it was built to transmit still transmits. The gap between the builders and the receivers is 12,000 years wide, and the stone bridges it. There are other underground spaces in western North America that have been known to researchers for longer than the British Columbia tunnels, and it is worth situating the BC findings in relation to those, because the context matters for understanding what is distinctive and what is part of a broader pattern. Caves have been documented across the region for well over a century, and some of them have been excavated and studied with considerable care. The caves of the Columbia Plateau, the limestone formations of the Okanagan, the sea caves of the outer coast, the lava tubes of the Cascade Volcanic Arc in Washington and Oregon, all of these have produced archaeological material that has contributed to the understanding of human activity in the region across various time periods. What distinguishes the tunnel system from these known cave sites is not simply the evidence of human modification, though that evidence is significant. It is the combination of the modification evidence with the dating evidence and the geometric characteristics. The known cave sites of the region show human use across various periods, but the modifications documented in them, where human modification can be identified at all, are consistent with the archaeological record of the periods in which they are dated. They fit the existing framework. They do not challenge it. The central interior tunnel challenges the existing framework specifically because of the combination of its age, its geometric regularity, its evidence of deliberate acoustic engineering, and its location in a geological context that, while not impossible for a natural cave formation, is sufficiently unusual to require explanation that natural processes alone cannot provide. It is the combination of factors, not any single factor in isolation, that makes the case for human construction compelling. Any one of the lines of evidence might be explained away by sufficiently creative application of natural geological processes. The combination of all of them pointing in the same direction is what the research team has consistently maintained constitutes the basis for the conclusion that the tunnel was built. The geological critique, which has been the most sustained and technically sophisticated challenge to the team's findings, has focused primarily on the dating evidence and the sealing geometry. The dating critique argues that the reservoir effect in the limestone environment could be making the organic material appear older than it actually is. The geometry critique argues that certain natural speleogenic processes can produce unusually regular passage dimensions under specific conditions. The research team has responded to both critiques with additional evidence. The dating has been supported by multiple independent methods, including optically stimulated luminescence dating of sediment layers that does not rely on carbon and is therefore not subject to the reservoir effect. The geometric critique has been addressed by the geoarchaeological analysis, showing that the specific sealing profile observed in the tunnel is not consistent with any known speleogenic process in limestone of this type and age. Neither critique has been definitively silenced, because science does not work through definitive silencing of competing views. But the weight of the evidence, as assessed by the majority of specialists who have reviewed it carefully, supports the research team's interpretation. The tunnel is what they say it is. That consensus, imperfect and contested as any scientific consensus is what has allowed the broader implications of the finding to begin receiving serious attention. The implications will not be accepted overnight, but they are being engaged with, argued about, and slowly integrated into the evolving understanding of what North American prehistory looked like. The story of the tunnels intersects, in ways that the research team has acknowledged but not fully explored, with a set of findings from a completely different field of research that has been generating significant attention over the same period. The field is ancient genomics, the study of DNA extracted from the remains of ancient individuals, and it has been producing results over the past decade that have, in the assessment of most specialists, forced a major revision of the models of how the Americas were populated. The old model, the one that served as orthodoxy for most of the 20th century, held that the Americas were populated in a single wave of migration from Siberia through the Bering Land Bridge, sometime around 13,000 years ago. The migrants spread southward, reached the tip of South America within a few thousand years, and from this single founding population, all the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere are descended. The ancient genomics data does not support this model. It supports something considerably more complex, multiple migrations at different times, some following the coast, some through the interior, some possibly crossing the Pacific, all resulting in a genetic landscape of the pre-contact Americas that was far more diverse than a single founding population could have produced. One of the most significant findings from the ancient genomics research is evidence of a population in South America whose genetic profile does not match what would be expected from a Bering Strait founding population, but shows surprising affinities with populations from Australia and Melanesia. This has been interpreted by the researchers who documented it as evidence of a trans-Pacific migration, of people crossing the Pacific Ocean and reaching the Americas before the conventional founding population had even arrived. This finding is relevant to the tunnel story for a specific reason. If there were people in the Americas before the conventional founding population, if there was a human presence on this continent that predated the migration that the standard model was built around, then the dating evidence from the tunnels becomes less anomalous, not more. People 12,000 or even 15,000 years ago in British Columbia, with enough organizational capacity to build a network of engineered underground passages, would fit within a model of continental peopling that allowed for deep time and multiple sources. The genomics findings have not resolved the question of who built the tunnels, because ancient DNA from the tunnel site itself, while collected during the field seasons, has proved difficult to extract and analyze due to the humidity conditions in the limestone environment, but they have widened the space of plausible explanations for what the tunnel building capacity implies about the organizational and demographic situation in Western North America at the end of the Ice Age. They are part of the same larger revision of assumptions about pre-contact American history that the tunnel findings are also part of. The picture that is emerging slowly and imperfectly from the convergence of archaeological, genomic, oral historical, and geophysical evidence is of a North America before European contact that was more deeply inhabited, more organizationally complex, more technologically capable, and more extensively networked than the received models had suggested. The British Columbia tunnels are one expression of that complexity. They are not an isolated anomaly in an otherwise simple landscape. They are one node in a network, one chapter in a story that is much longer and richer than the story that was previously being told. Let us think for a moment about scale. The tunnel system in the central interior of British Columbia is approximately 3.5 kilometers long. That is a significant piece of underground construction. At the dimensions documented, 2 meters high and 2.5 meters wide, the tunnel represents a volume of excavated rock of approximately 17,500 cubic meters. That is a lot of rock to remove from beneath a mountain. Now consider the full distribution of anomalies that Ways analysis documented. 112 anomaly locations spread across western North America from northern Alaska to the Oregon border. If each of those locations represents a tunnel system, comparable in scale to the central interior example, which we do not know, but which the preliminary surveys of several of the other sites suggest is at least plausible, then the cumulative volume of rock that would have been removed to create the network is extraordinary. Many millions of cubic meters removed with stone tools by hand over an extended period of time. How long would it have taken? That calculation depends on too many unknowns to produce a reliable estimate. The tools available, the number of workers, the hours per day that work could proceed, the nature of the limestone, which varies considerably in hardness and fracturability, the specific techniques employed. All of these variables would affect the rate of progress, and we do not know any of them with precision. But we can make some rough estimates based on what we know of stone tool quarrying rates in comparable contexts. Archaeological studies of Neolithic stone quarrying in Europe, for which we have reasonably good data, suggest that a skilled worker using stone tools could remove roughly 1 cubic meter of limestone per day under favorable conditions. At that rate, the 3.5-kilometer tunnel alone would have required approximately 17,500 person days of work, not counting the time for transport of removed material, acoustic modification of walls, floor preparation, and other associated tasks. 17,500 person days is a lot, but it is not impossibly a lot, not even for a relatively small group of people working consistently over a period of years. A group of 20 skilled workers devoting half their working time to the project could, at that rate, complete the main tunnel in under 5 years. The question is not really whether the physical work was feasible. The question is about the organizational capacity, the ability to sustain a focused collective project over multiple years, to maintain the institutional knowledge of what was being built and why, to ensure continuity of effort across the disruptions that inevitably affect any human community over the course of several years. That organizational capacity is exactly what the critics of the tunnel-less human construction hypothesis have doubted. It is what the team's research, and particularly Riverbend's revisionist work on the organizational capacities of non-agricultural societies, has progressively argued was present in the communities of late Pleistocene and early Holocene Western North America. The argument does not require those communities to have been identical to later agricultural civilizations in their social organization. It requires only that they were capable of the kind of sustained collective effort that many foraging and hunter-gatherer societies have been documented to achieve when the motivation and organizational framework are in place. Göbekli Tepe, built by hunter-gatherers in Anatolia 12,000 years ago, required organizational capacity of comparable scale to what the BC tunnels imply. The Cahokia Mounds in the American Midwest, built by a society that was not fully agricultural in the European sense, required organizational capacity that dwarfs both. The assumption that organizational complexity scales with agricultural status is simply false, and the evidence from multiple archaeological contexts across the world has been making this point for decades. It is impossible to talk about the BC tunnels without talking about what was nearly lost, not the tunnels themselves, which have proven to be extraordinarily durable. What was nearly lost, and what in some respects was partially lost, was the knowledge of what the tunnels are and what they mean. That knowledge has survived in the communities whose ancestors built the tunnels, in forms that were protected by the same determination and ingenuity that the ancestors themselves displayed when they built the passages in the first place. But the survival of that knowledge was not a foregone conclusion. It required active effort, active resistance, active maintenance in the face of colonial pressures that were designed, explicitly and systematically, to disrupt exactly this kind of intergenerational knowledge transmission. The history of what those pressures looked like in British Columbia specifically is not an abstract history. It is a history of specific policies enacted by specific governments with specific outcomes that are still being lived with by the communities whose histories they attempted to destroy. The residential school system, which removed indigenous children from their families and communities and subjected them to a regime designed to replace their languages, cultures, and identities with those of the colonial power, operated in British Columbia as in other parts of Canada, with effects on knowledge transmission that would have been catastrophic had the community's resistance been any less fierce. Some knowledge was lost, some languages were damaged, some ceremonial traditions were interrupted for a generation or more. The intergenerational transmission of specific cultural and ecological knowledge was disrupted in ways that have taken decades of community-led recovery work to begin to address. And yet the knowledge of the tunnel survived. It survived in the memories of elders who maintained it through everything. It survived in the ceremonial contexts that were practiced in secret when public practice was prohibited. It survived in the geographic relationship between the communities and the landscape, in the knowledge of where specific places were and what they meant that was never fully suppressed because the landscape itself was there, steady and unchanging, holding the specific locations of sacred features in its own permanent record. When the Provincial Archaeology Office initiated the consultation process with Secwepemc cultural authorities in 2004, the knowledge was there, intact and ready. The community could immediately identify what the 2003 survey data was describing because they had never stopped knowing about it. That is the thing that the scientific investigation, for all its rigor and its significant contributions to the story, cannot quite convey: the continuity of the knowledge within the community. The fact that the knowledge did not require rediscovery, that it was never lost, that what the scientists found had been held in trust all along by the people who had always been responsible for it. The scientific investigation made the knowledge legible to institutions that had been refusing to acknowledge it in its original form. That is a real and important contribution, but it is a contribution that must be held in its proper relationship to the primary fact, which is that the communities knew. The communities kept knowing through residential schools and colonial land, appropriation and cultural suppression, and every other weapon the colonial state deployed against them. They kept knowing, and they kept the knowledge alive, and when the moment came to share it on terms that respected their sovereignty over their own heritage, they did. That is not a footnote to the story of the British Columbia tunnels. It is the story of the British Columbia tunnels. Everything else is context. There is a conversation that happened in 2016 that several members of the research team have mentioned in their published work and in public talks, a conversation that none of them can quite forget. It happened during one of the community consultation meetings in a Secwepemc community in the central interior. The formal agenda items had been covered, the research updates had been presented, the questions had been asked and answered. The meeting was winding down in the way that meetings do, people gathering their papers and checking the time, the informal conversations beginning at the edges of the room. And then an elder woman who had been quiet for most of the meeting said something in Secwepemc, the language of her people, that was translated by the cultural liaison officer. She said, roughly translated, they were not the only ones. The researchers looked at each other. Riverbend asked gently what she meant. She said again in Secwepemc, with the liaison officer translating, the ones who made the passages, they knew others who made passages too. The stories say they knew people from far away, not enemies, not strangers, people who shared something with them, who came from different places, but who had the same understanding of the below world. Far away, the researchers pressed. How far? She smiled and said something that the liaison officer took a moment to render. As far as the world goes. As far as the world goes. Nobody spoke for a moment after that translation was offered. The elder added one more thing, which the liaison officer translated with evident care. The stories don't say those people were like us. They say they were older, different. that the knowledge of the below world came from them, that our people received it and cared for it, but did not make it first. Older, different, the knowledge came from them. Riverbend wrote those phrases in his notebook and underlined them and has returned to them many times since. He has been careful in everything he has written and said publicly not to overinterpret them. He does not know what the elders' words point to. He does not know whether the oral tradition is describing actual contact with an earlier population whose technological and cultural traditions form the foundation of what the builders of the tunnels knew, or whether the reference to something older and different is a way of expressing the antiquity and mystery of the knowledge, of saying that it predates any currently living memory, that its origins are beyond the reach of even the longest oral tradition. But he has not forgotten the conversation. And when he thinks about the question of who built the tunnels and what the network they were part of implies about the organizational and cultural situation in ancient North America, he returns to what the elder said, as far as the world goes. Older, different, the knowledge came from them. The question of what the tunnels connected to has many dimensions, and not all of them point inward toward the geological and archaeological evidence. Some of them point outward toward the broader question of what kind of world the builders were living in and what kinds of connections they maintained with the wider human world. At the time the tunnels were built, roughly 12 to 13,000 years ago, the world was not the world as it exists today. The map was different. The continental outlines were different because the sea levels were lower by roughly 120 meters. What is now the shallow continental shelf off the coast of British Columbia was dry land, a broad coastal plain that extended for tens of kilometers beyond the current shoreline. That coastal plain has since been drowned by the rising seas that accompanied the end of the Ice Age, and has not been archaeologically investigated to any significant degree because it is underwater. But the people who lived on that coastal plain and who would have used it as a highway connecting the communities of the coast across enormous distances were not archaeologically invisible. They left traces. The traces are mostly submerged now, but some have been found on the edges of the now drowned plain, in the intertidal zones and shallow coastal waters where archaeological material has occasionally been exposed by wave action or revealed by diving surveys. What those traces show is consistent with what the oral traditions of coastal indigenous peoples describe: a coastline that was inhabited for a very long time by peoples who were connected to each other through trade and ceremonial exchange and shared knowledge traditions, who traveled along the coast in watercraft capable of sustained ocean travel, and who were in contact not only with each other, but with the interior peoples whose territories began where the coastal plain ended. The tunnels, in this geographic context, may have been part of a connectivity system that included not just underground passages through the mountains, but maritime routes along the coast and overland routes through the interior. A system that connected the coast to the interior and the interior to the mountains, and the mountains to each other, across the full north-south extent of the western seaboard. If that connectivity system existed, its traces are divided between the drowned coastal plain, where they are mostly inaccessible, the mountain tunnel network, where they are becoming increasingly visible through the ongoing investigations, and the oral traditions of the communities that maintain memory of it across the millennia. None of the three types of evidence is complete on its own. Together, they begin to suggest a picture of a connected coastal civilization that used the full geography of the Pacific Northwest, above and below ground, on the surface and underground, to sustain networks of communication and exchange across distances that would challenge our assumptions about what was possible without modern technology. Possible. That word comes up repeatedly in this story, always in the context of something that conventional archaeology had assumed was not possible and then turned out to be. Possible to maintain social organization at the scale required to build a network of tunnels. Possible to engineer specific acoustic effects in underground spaces with Stone Age tools. Possible to sustain oral traditions with enough precision to accurately describe subsurface features over 12,000 years. Possible to cross the Pacific. Possible to build large-scale ceremonial structures without agriculture. All of these things turn out to be possible, and every time the range of what was possible is extended, the picture of the deep human past becomes richer, more complex, more genuinely impressive. The researchers who have devoted the most sustained attention to the British Columbia tunnel system over the past 2 decades are, by now, different people than they were when the investigation began. Calloway, who started the whole thing with her accidental encounter with a misfiled infrastructure survey, retired from her full professorship at UBC in 2022, but remains active in the research, serving as a senior advisor to the ongoing investigation. She has said in several interviews that the tunnel project changed how she understood her field in ways that she did not anticipate when she first pulled up the radar data in 2004. She began her career with a clear sense of what karst geomorphology was and what its methods could tell you, and she has ended it with a sense that the methods are fine, but the frameworks they were operating within were far too narrow, far too constrained by assumptions about what had and had not happened in this landscape. Riverbend published his most comprehensive synthetic account of the tunnel findings and their implications in a book that appeared in 2023, aimed at a general audience rather than an academic one. The book has done what the peer-reviewed papers could not quite do, which is to tell the full story in a way that allows readers who are not specialists to grasp both the specific evidence and the larger significance of what it implies. The book has been widely read and widely discussed in Canada and internationally, and has contributed significantly to the public awareness of what is at stake in the ongoing research. Acheson, the structural geologist, shifted the focus of his research in the late 2010s toward what he calls structural archaeology, the study of the engineering knowledge encoded in ancient built environments. The BC tunnel investigation gave him a new lens for thinking about structures that he had previously analyzed purely in terms of their physical properties, and he has applied that lens to a number of other ancient structures worldwide, finding in each case evidence of engineering knowledge that was more sophisticated than the conventional dating and cultural context of the structure had suggested possible. The graduate student, Chen Wei, is now a full professor at Simon Fraser University, where he runs a lab dedicated to systematic analysis of subsurface anomaly data from survey archives across Canada. The lab has since expanded its scope to include comparable archives from the United States and Mexico, and is working toward the development of a comprehensive database of subsurface anomaly data that could be cross-referenced and analyzed at the continental scale that the research increasingly requires. The SECWEPMO cultural liaison officer from the 2004 consultations has become, in the years since, one of the most significant voices in the ongoing public conversation about the tunnels and what they mean for Indigenous sovereignty and cultural heritage. She has spoken about the investigation at academic conferences, policy forums, and public lectures across Canada and internationally, articulating with clarity and force the perspective that the communities bring to the work, the knowledge that the communities hold that the scientific investigation is only beginning to access, and the conditions under which that knowledge can appropriately be shared and used. The team has grown and changed and dispersed and reconvened over 2 decades, and the work has grown with it, expanding from a single, anomalous radar return to a research program that encompasses geology, archaeology, acoustics, genomics, ecology, oral history, remote sensing, and architectural analysis. It is one of the most genuinely interdisciplinary research programs in North American science, and its interdisciplinarity is not incidental but essential. The tunnels are not just a geological phenomenon, or just an archaeological phenomenon, or just a community heritage matter. They are all of these simultaneously, and understanding them requires all of these perspectives simultaneously. What the light above ground is changing somewhere as you listen to this, whether you are in British Columbia, where the mountains the research team has been studying are probably dark right now, their forests silent, their limestone foundations doing what limestone foundations have been doing for 12,000 years, or whether you are somewhere else, entirely, somewhere on the other side of the planet from the interior plateau, where the tunnels run deep and quiet beneath the surface of a landscape that has been inhabited longer than the conventional history of this continent acknowledged. The light is changing, or it has changed, or it will change. The world turns, the ice age ended. The seas rose and drowned the coastal plains where the ancestors of the tunnel builders may have walked and fished and traded knowledge. The mountains stood as mountains do, indifferent to the time that moved across their surfaces, holding their inner spaces intact and quiet against the 12,000-year progression of the world above. In that inner space, the silence still has the quality that the researchers describe as deeply familiar. The walls still catch your sound and return it slightly changed. The ceiling still arches in the proportions that someone calculated with careful hands in the light of a stone lamp, long before anyone living had been born. The resonance still rises at 110 hertz when someone speaks or sings at the right pitch, still fills the length of the passage with the kind of distributed hum that the builders designed it to produce. The knowledge is still there, encoded in stone, patient as stone, waiting, as it has always been waiting for whoever comes next. The researchers came with their radar and their dating equipment and their acoustic measuring instruments and their willingness to follow the evidence wherever it led. The community knowledge holders came with their oral traditions and their ceremonial authority and their 12,000-year relationship to the space. Together, they have begun to read what the stone has been saying all along. They are not finished. The reading is not finished. There are sections of the passage that have not yet been fully documented, anomaly locations in the corridors that have not yet been visited, junction points whose architectural complexity has not yet been fully analyzed, and beneath all of it, the deeper question of where the knowledge that built these spaces originally came from, and what the full extent of the network it was part of actually encompassed. Those questions will occupy researchers for decades. Some will be answered, others will remain open, the way the best questions always remain at least partially open, pointing beyond their current answers towards something that keeps receding as you approach it. That is not a frustrating quality in a question. It is the quality that makes a question worth pursuing for a lifetime. There is a specific stone in the main chamber of the central interior tunnel, a stone near the western wall that the research team has documented carefully and that the Sequipemikis community has identified as significant in their oral tradition. It is a piece of limestone that has been shaped, not extravagantly, not in the way that a sculpture is shaped, but with specific attention paid to specific surfaces. 3 of its faces have been smoothed by contact with worked stone tools. One face has a marking that the specialists in ancient notation systems have been unable to categorize within any known system, but have confirmed is not a natural feature of the rock surface. The marking is simple. It is a set of lines arranged in a pattern. The lines are not random. They repeat in a way that suggests they encode something, the way any notation system encodes something, but what they encode remains opaque to everyone who has examined them. The research team has photographed the marking from every angle and under every lighting condition. They have used photogrammetry to create a three-dimensional model of the marked surface. They have shared the image with specialists in ancient notation systems, rock art, and early symbolic systems from multiple countries and multiple cultural traditions. Nobody has been able to say definitively what the marking means. The Sekwepemc elder who spoke at the 2016 consultation meeting, the one who said that the ones who made the passages knew people from far away, was asked about the stone and its marking. She looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she said in Sekwepemc something that the cultural liaison officer translated as, "That is older than our memory of it." Older than our memory of it. The marking on the stone in the western wall of the main chamber is, in the elder's assessment, older than the memory that the Sekwepemc oral tradition preserves. It predates the knowledge of the community that has been responsible for the tunnels for as long as anyone can trace. It is a message from an even deeper past, from whoever it was that the elder meant, when she said that the knowledge of the below world came from people who were older and different. That message has been waiting in the stone, in the dark, in the silence of the chamber, 45 meters below the surface of British Columbia, for longer than the oral tradition of the community that has kept watch over it can reach. It is still waiting. We do not yet know how to read it. Perhaps the truest thing that can be said about the British Columbia tunnel investigation after 20 years and hundreds of thousands of research hours and dozens of peer-reviewed papers and the ongoing collaboration between scientific teams and indigenous communities is that it has not produced a final answer. What it has produced is a more honest question. The old question, the one that the conventional archaeology of North America had been implicitly asking for most of its history, was how do we fit the evidence of human activity in this continent into the framework we have already built for understanding what was here before European contact? The new question, the one that the tunnel findings have forced, is what actually was here, and how do we build a framework adequate to understanding it? Those are different questions. The first question looks at the evidence through a pre-existing framework and asks how the evidence can be accommodated within that framework. It tends to produce conservative interpretations because the framework has built-in assumptions about what was possible and what was not, and evidence that seems to challenge those assumptions gets explained away or set aside. The second question starts with the evidence and asks what framework would be adequate to it. It tends to produce more radical interpretations because the evidence, taken seriously on its own terms, rather than filtered through pre-existing assumptions, is often more remarkable than the pre-existing framework can contain. The British Columbia tunnels demand the second kind of question. They cannot be accommodated within the old framework without either explaining away the dating evidence, or explaining away the geometric evidence, or explaining away the acoustic evidence, or explaining away the oral tradition evidence, or somehow explaining away all of them simultaneously. Some critics of the research have tried variations of all of these approaches. None has succeeded in producing an explanation that accounts for all of the evidence with less complexity than the straightforward interpretation that human beings built these tunnels at the end of the Ice Age as part of a continental network of underground spaces serving ceremonial, infrastructural, and knowledge transmission purposes. The straightforward interpretation is not simple. It implies a revision of the conventional story of North American prehistory that is, at this point in the scientific conversation, substantial but not yet complete. It requires accepting that the organizational capacity of pre-contact indigenous peoples in Western North America was considerably greater than the conventional model had suggested. It requires accepting that the knowledge traditions of those peoples, as encoded in their oral histories and as demonstrated by the physical evidence of their constructed environments, were considerably more sophisticated than the conventional model had acknowledged. It requires accepting that the history of this continent is considerably longer, deeper, and richer than the history we were taught. These are things worth accepting because they are true. They are supported by the evidence, and they are things that, in accepting them, we become closer to understanding not just the history of British Columbia or North America, but the history of what human beings are and what we have always been capable of when we organize ourselves well, care for our knowledge and our landscapes, and build for the generations that come after. The last thing that needs to be said before the silence comes back and the story settles into the dark is about gratitude. The knowledge that the tunnels exist, that they were built by human beings, that they are part of something larger than any individual site, that they have been maintained in the knowledge of indigenous communities across 12,000 years of history. This knowledge is available now in the public domain, subject to the ongoing processes of scientific investigation and community-led stewardship that will continue to develop and deepen it. It is available because a number of people, at a number of points in the story, chose to do the right thing, chose to share and collaborate and take seriously what they were being shown, rather than dismissing or appropriating or sensationalizing or competing over it. Calloway found the data and shared it with her colleagues. Her colleagues took it seriously. The Provincial Archaeology Office initiated consultation rather than proceeding unilaterally. The Secwepemc community chose to collaborate on terms they helped to set. The research team committed to genuine partnership rather than extractive investigation. The indigenous knowledge holders decided that the time had come to share what the community had always known with the institutions that needed to know it in order to change. Each of those decisions could have gone differently. Any one of them going differently could have derailed the entire process. The investigation of the British Columbia tunnels is not just a story about what was found. It is a story about how it was found, about the relationships and the decisions and the commitments to doing the work right that made the finding possible. That story deserves to be told alongside the discovery itself, because it demonstrates something that is as important as anything the tunnels themselves demonstrate, that this kind of work can be done right, that scientific investigation and indigenous community stewardship can operate as genuine partners, that the knowledge embedded in the land and the knowledge embedded in the community and the knowledge embedded in the scientific methods can all inform each other in ways that make the collective understanding richer than any one of them could have produced alone. The tunnels have been there for 12,000 years. The knowledge of them has been maintained for 12,000 years. The investigation that has made that knowledge legible to a broader world has been going on for 20 years. In the context of 12,000 years, 20 years is an eye blink. The work is beginning, and everything it has produced so far, every paper and field season and consultation meeting and acoustic measurement and LiDAR survey and ancient DNA sample, is merely the preface to a story that is going to take a very long time to fully tell. Now let the silence come back. Let the mountains of British Columbia stand in the dark outside the range of your imagination, holding their inner spaces, their vaulted passages, and their resonant chambers, and their marked stones, and their 12,000-year-old questions. Let the research continue without you, as it will. Let the communities keep watch over what they have always kept watch over, and let yourself drift towards sleep knowing this. Beneath the surface of the world, in the limestone of the mountains, in the darkness that has held its particular quality of familiar silence for 12 millennia, something built by human hands is waiting, not waiting for the scientists to finish their analysis, not waiting for the academic journals to reach their conclusions, not waiting for the world to decide what it thinks about what lies beneath British Columbia, just waiting, the way stone waits, the way knowledge waits, the way the longest stories wait for the moments when they can be told and received and carried forward by new voices into new silences. The tunnels are part of the longest story. They have been waiting 12,000 years for this moment of telling, and they will wait as long as necessary for the next one. Rest now. The story knows where it is going. The stone knows what it holds. And somewhere beneath the mountains, in a chamber 45 meters below the surface of a province that sits quietly on the western edge of a vast country, the walls listen for the next voice to enter. The silence and find in the particular quality of the space the deeply familiar recognition that the builders built into it all those thousands of years ago. We are heard here. We have always been heard here. The tunnels are still listening. End of script. There is a river that runs through the central interior of British Columbia called the Thompson. It is a large river fed by snowmelt from ranges whose peaks still carry ice through the summer months, and it has been flowing through this landscape for far longer than any human memory reaches. The Thompson's watershed encompasses a vast territory of plateau and mountain terrain, and for thousands of years before the first European explorers arrived in this corner of the continent, the river was the central organizing feature of the human geography of the region. The Secwepemc, whose territory the river flows through, have maintained a relationship with the Thompson since time before time, as their oral tradition expresses it. The river is part of their identity in a sense that goes beyond the ecological and practical relationship of a community to a water source. It is, in the tradition, a living entity, a presence with its own character and its own place in the network of relationships that constitute the world as the Secwepemc understand it. This is relevant to the tunnel story because of where the tunnel system is positioned relative to the Thompson watershed. The central interior tunnel runs more or less perpendicular to the Thompson River's course in the section of the watershed where it has been documented. The eastern end of the tunnel, where it approaches the surface and presumably connects to whatever entry and exit features were in use during the period when the system was active, is positioned on the eastern edge of the watershed. The western end, which descends to the large chamber 45 meters below the surface, points in the direction of the river's main valley. This positioning was noted in the research team's documentation, but was initially treated as an incidental geographical fact rather than a significant design feature. It was Riverbend who eventually pointed out in a paper from 2020 that the relationship between the tunnel orientation and the watershed topography was likely not incidental. The Thompson watershed defines the water drainage patterns of the region, which in turn define the landscape's ecological productivity, which in turn defines where human communities could sustain themselves over long periods. A tunnel running perpendicular to the river, with its deep end oriented toward the river valley, would position its users to move between the interior plateau and the river valley without using the surface routes, which in the mountainous terrain of the region would have been significantly more difficult and more exposed to the weather conditions that characterize a late Pleistocene environment. This was the infrastructural interpretation again, but with more geographic specificity. The tunnel was not just a connection between two abstractly defined points. It was a connection between specific ecological zones that would have had complementary resource profiles at different times of year. The plateau country, with its grassland and open forest resources, and the river valley, with its salmon runs and valley bottom plant communities. A community that could move between these zones efficiently and reliably, regardless of surface conditions, would have had a significant ecological advantage over one that was limited to surface travel. The salmon runs of the Thompson River were, for thousands of years before the river was dammed and its fish populations decimated by industrial development, one of the most significant natural resources in western North America. The Thompson drainage supported salmon runs of extraordinary abundance, tens of millions of fish annually returning from the Pacific through the Fraser River system and up into the Thompson tributaries, providing a resource that could be harvested, processed, and stored in quantities that would support substantial populations through the winter months. Access to those runs would have been enormously valuable to any community in the region, and the tunnel, positioned as it is relative to the watershed, would have provided precisely that access in a reliable and weather-independent form to the communities on the plateau above. This is speculative. The research team is careful to say so, but it is speculative in the way that good archaeology is always speculative, grounded in the physical evidence, informed by ecological understanding, consistent with the oral tradition, and offering an interpretation that accounts for the evidence with plausibility, if not with certainty. The salmon runs bring up another dimension of the story that has not yet been adequately explored in the published research, but that several members of the team have discussed in informal contexts. The question of what the tunnel network means for our understanding of the subsistence economies of the communities that built and used it. The conventional picture of subsistence in pre-contact British Columbia, particularly in the interior regions, has been of relatively small and mobile communities following seasonal resource cycles across the landscape, harvesting different resources at different times in different locations, without the kind of fixed base or stable surplus that would allow for population concentrations or complex social organization. This picture is not wrong in its basic outlines. The ecology of the interior plateau does support a seasonal subsistence pattern, and the archaeological record of surface sites in the region is consistent with that pattern. What the tunnel system adds is the possibility that the seasonal subsistence economy was more complex and more integrated than the surface record alone has shown. If the tunnels provided reliable and weather-independent routes between ecological zones, they would have extended the effective resource territory of the communities using them. They would have allowed communities to access salmon runs without being limited to the surface travel routes that the mountainous terrain would otherwise have constrained them to. They would have provided stable, temperature-controlled storage environments for the preserved foods, particularly dried salmon, that were the basis of winter subsistence, and they would have allowed for the kind of coordinated movement of people and resources between communities that the distribution of the tunnel network implies. In other words, the tunnel system may have been the infrastructure that made a regional economy possible, in the sense that economists use that term, a system of exchange and distribution across a territory too large and ecologically diverse for any single community to access on its own. The tunnels would have been the transportation and storage network that allowed the communities of the plateau and the river valleys to specialize in a modest sense and to share what they produced across a geographic area that their collective knowledge of the landscape encompassed. This is a significant possibility. If it is borne out by continued research, it would mean that the pre-contact communities of British Columbia's interior had developed in the centuries or millennia during which the tunnel network was in active use, something that looks recognizably like a regional economy with the specialized production, organized exchange, and coordinated distribution of resources that term implies. Not an economy in the sense that modern economics studies, not an economy with markets and prices and accounting systems, but an economy in the original sense of the word, from the Greek oikos, household, and nomos, management or law, the management of a household's resources. The household in this case being not a nuclear family or even a single community, but a regional network of communities that thought of themselves as sharing a common territory and a common interest in the well-being of that territory and each other. The evidence for that kind of regional identity comes most clearly not from the tunnels themselves, but from the oral traditions that describe them. The traditions do not speak of the tunnels as the property of a single community or as serving the interests of a single group. They speak of them as shared infrastructure, as features of the landscape that were maintained in the interests of all the peoples who use them, subject to protocols that were understood and respected across the relevant communities. That description matches, in interesting ways, what the archaeological evidence is suggesting about the physical distribution of the tunnel network. The network is too large and spans too many individual communities' territories to have been the project of any single group. If it is what the evidence suggests it was a collective undertaking, planned and built and maintained by communities acting together across a geographic scale that implies intercommunity cooperation of a sophisticated kind. The word that keeps coming up in this context, in both the oral tradition documentation and the academic papers, is governance. Not governance in the modern political sense, with formal institutions and written codes and enforcement mechanisms, but governance in the deeper sense, the set of arrangements through which a group of people coordinate their activities and resolve their disagreements and maintain the shared infrastructure on which their collective well-being depends. The tunnel network required governance. Somebody or some set of people representing the relevant communities had to make decisions about where the tunnels would go and how they would be built, and who would have access to them, under what conditions, and how they would be maintained, and what the consequences would be for violations of the protocols governing their use. Those decisions had to be made and maintained and updated as circumstances changed over the generations during which the network was in active use. The oral traditions preserve traces of those governance arrangements in the form of the protocols they describe for entering and using the underground spaces. The protocols are specific and detailed and clearly the product of a long tradition of practical experience with what works and what does not when managing access to a shared resource of this kind. They reflect the accumulated wisdom of generations of community governance applied to the specific challenges and opportunities of the tunnel network. That is a remarkable legacy. More remarkable in some ways than the physical tunnels themselves, because physical tunnels are built from rock, and rock endures. But governance arrangements are built from agreements and shared understandings and community trust, and these things are far more fragile, far more dependent on the continuous maintenance of the relationships and practices that sustain them. That the governance traditions associated with the tunnel network have survived at all in any recognizable form is a testimony to the resilience of the communities that maintain them, and that they have survived in enough detail to inform the research team's understanding of what the tunnels were for and how they were used is a testimony to the quality and dedication of the cultural practice and transmission that the Secwepemc and their neighbors have maintained across generations of extraordinary pressure. It is late, or it is early. The distinction is not always clear in the hours when the mind is closest to sleep and the boundary between waking thought and dreaming begins to dissolve. In those hours, the tunnels feel less remote than they do in the rational light of day. In those hours, the 12,000-year gap between the people who built the passages and the people who are learning about them collapses in ways that the waking rational mind resists. The deeply familiar quality of the silence that the researchers describe becomes easier to imagine and therefore easier to feel, because the imagination that operates in the near sleep state is less constrained by the protocols of analytical distance than the imagination that operates in full wakefulness. In those hours you can almost hear it, not the tunnel itself, which is silent in the way that stone is silent, which is to say not entirely silent, but quiet with the quiet of great mass and great age, but the residue of what the tunnel has held over 12,000 years. The people who have stood in it, spoken in it, listened to the resonance of their own voices, returned to them by the shaped walls. The practitioners who came there for specific purposes, prepared in specific ways, to receive what the space offered. The generations of knowledge holders who visited it in the ordinary course of maintaining their relationship with the landscape, checking on the condition of the passages, ensuring that the protocols were still intact, that the memory of what the space was for had not faded. The tunnel holds all of them, not as ghost presences, not as supernatural residue, but as the simple physical record of everything that has happened in a space over a very long time. The walls of the tunnel have been breathed in by thousands of people over 12,000 years. Their breath, transformed by the tunnel's chemistry into the faintest traces, has become part of the tunnel's atmosphere. Their touch on the walls over generations has altered the surface texture in ways that the most sensitive analysis could perhaps detect. Their sound, their voices, and their drum beats and their footsteps has been absorbed and re-emitted by the acoustic structure of the space in an ongoing exchange that has not ceased in 12,000 years and will not cease until the stone itself deteriorates. The tunnel is alive with human presence, accumulated over millennia in ways that the reductive vocabulary of most science is not equipped to express. The acoustic researchers, who deal professionally with the physical properties of sound in enclosed spaces, come closest to articulating it when they describe the space as responsive. The tunnel responds to presence. That is both a technical fact about its acoustic properties and something more than a technical fact. It is a description of what it feels like to be in a space that has been shaped by human intention to receive and respond to human presence, and that has been doing so continuously for a very long time. The physical anthropologist on the research team, a specialist in the study of ancient human remains and what they can tell us about the lives and bodies of the people who produced them, spent the 2016 field season focused specifically on the floor sediments of the main passage and the chamber. What she found in those sediments was not unexpected given the research context, but it was unexpectedly poignant in its specificity. Among the carbonized plant material and the deliberate sediment layers that had previously been sampled for dating, she identified microscopic traces of material that she has described in her papers as biological indicators of human activity. This is a deliberately broad term, covering evidence of human presence that the biological remains themselves provide, rather than the cultural artifacts associated with them. In this case, the biological indicators included fragments of human hair, too small to see with the naked eye but detectable under microscopy, microscopic fragments of human skin cells, traces of what might be ochre, the red pigment that appears in burials and ritual contexts across the world for hundreds of thousands of years. These traces were found in sediment layers that dated to the same period as the other early occupation. Evidence in the tunnel, 12 to 13,000 years before present. The hair and skin fragments are all that remains, physically, of specific individuals who were in the tunnel during that period. Their names are unknown. Their faces are unknown. Their community affiliations, their specific roles in the social structure of their time, their personal histories, all unknown. But they were there, real individuals in this specific space, in this specific period. Their bodies left traces that persisted in the sediment for 12,000 years and were recoverable by the careful analysis of a 21st century scientist. The physical anthropologist has described the experience of holding the analysis data for those traces in her hands as one of the most affecting moments of her professional career. Not for the scientific information the data contained, which was limited, but for what it represented, direct physical continuity between specific ancient individuals and the specific space that those individuals had occupied and shaped and cared for. A biological thread stretching from then to now, from the people who built the tunnels to the people who are learning about them, thinner than a strand of hair and just as real. The question of what drew people to the tunnels in the first place, the very first people, the ones who either built them or first encountered natural features and began developing them, is one that the research cannot fully answer. It can document what the tunnels became and how they were used across the long period of their known history. It cannot document the moment of first encounter or first decision, the moment when someone stood at the edge of a limestone formation in the mountains of what would become British Columbia and understood or intuited or received from some prior knowledge tradition that what was here could be shaped into something of lasting value. The oral tradition of the Secwepemcs speaks of the knowledge of the below world as received knowledge, as something that came from elsewhere, from people who are described as older and different. This suggests that the communities that eventually became the custodians of the tunnel system in British Columbia may not have been its original builders, or may have been working within a knowledge tradition received from an earlier source. That earlier source remains, for now, beyond the reach of any tool the research team has available. The tunnels themselves are the oldest direct evidence. Whatever came before them, whatever knowledge, tradition, or community first developed, the understanding of how to shape underground spaces for human purposes in this part of the world has left no physical record that has yet been found. This is not unusual in archaeology. Most of the most important developments in human history left no direct record of their moments of origin. The first use of fire, the first cultivation of a plant, the first construction of a boat capable of open water travel, these were not events that were documented by the people who participated in them, and the evidence that allows us to place them in approximate time and approximate location is indirect, inferential, always several steps removed from the actual moment. The origin of the tunnel building tradition in Western North America is similarly opaque. What is visible is the tradition in its mature form, already sophisticated, already organized, already connected across a network that implies generations of development behind it. The origin moment, the first decision, and the first chisel stroke is out of sight somewhere in the deeper past, where the tools for recovery have not yet been able to reach. Perhaps they will be reached eventually. Perhaps the ongoing development of ancient DNA analysis or of archaeological methods for recovering and dating extremely old organic material will eventually push the recoverable record back, far enough to catch a glimpse of the beginning of the tradition. Perhaps some archive somewhere holds a survey report that, like the 2003 infrastructure report that started this whole investigation, contains data that points towards something even older and even less expected. The investigation continues. The questions continue. The darkness of the tunnel holds whatever it holds, and the world above it which now knows the tunnel is there, goes on developing the methods and the relationships and the frameworks of understanding that will eventually be adequate to the full depth of what it contains. When the morning comes, wherever you are, the light will find the mountains in the same way it has always found them, slanting across the peaks first, then dropping into the valleys, then reaching the forest floor through the canopy, where the old trees filter it into something gentler than full sun. The rivers will catch the light in the way they always do, their surfaces shifting from dark to silver to the particular green that Thompson water turns in. The hour after dawn, beneath all of that, the tunnels will be dark. The way they are always dark. The way they were dark when the ice was still on the mountains above them, and dark when the glaciers pulled back and left the raw land to reorganize itself, and dark through every generation of the 12,000 years since people first came there and shaped the space to receive them. The dark is not empty. The dark is full of what the stone holds, what the shaped walls hold, what the deliberately prepared floor holds, what the acoustic engineering holds, what the 12,000 years of human presence holds in whatever form presence can be held by stone. The researchers know the dark is full. They have spent weeks at a time in it, and they have come back, changed in ways that are difficult to articulate, but that persist. The community knowledge holders have always known the dark is full. Their oral traditions say so, and their ceremonial practices maintain a relationship with what the dark holds, and that relationship has been ongoing since before any living memory. The world above knows now too, in the way that knowledge works when it becomes public, which is to say imperfectly and partially, and filtered through all the distortions that media and public discourse introduce, but genuinely, substantively, in ways that have already begun to change how many people think about the history of this continent and the capacities of the peoples who inhabited it before the ships came from the east. That change is still in its early stages. The research is still in its early stages. The conversation between science and community knowledge that the investigation has generated is still in its early stages. The revision of the conventional story of North American prehistory that the findings require is still in its early stages. Everything about this is still beginning, and that is the right note on which to let the story rest, for now, because the stories that matter are always still beginning. The ones that are finished, the ones that have arrived at their conclusions and closed their loops and tied their threads, those are the stories that belong fully to the past. The ones that are still unfolding, still generating new questions, still pointing toward new horizons that keep extending as you approach them, those are the stories that belong to the future, that will be told and retold and revised and deepened by voices that have not yet begun to speak. The tunnels beneath British Columbia are a story that belongs to the future. They have been patient about it for 12,000 years. They can wait a little longer for the rest of it to emerge. Let the silence come now. Let the mind release its hold on the details, on the survey dates and the acoustic frequencies and the character counts in the geological reports and the names of the rivers and the discussions in the academic journals. Let them settle the way sediment settles in still water, drifting down slowly until they find their place in the larger picture. What remains, when the details settle, is something simpler than any specific fact. It is the knowledge that the earth is deeper than the surface, that the history of this place and every place extends further down and further back than the visible record shows, that the people who were here before left traces that persist in forms that we are only beginning to learn to read, that the knowledge those people had and maintained and transmitted across generations of extraordinary difficulty is real knowledge, earned knowledge, knowledge that the world needs and that is available to us if we approach it with the respect and the humility and the patience it deserves. That is what the tunnels beneath British Columbia have shown the world, and that is what the world is still learning from. Rest now with that knowledge. The tunnels know you are here. The stone is listening. The silence has always been waiting for you. End of script. There are things that happen at a specific depth underground that do not happen anywhere else. The atmospheric pressure changes in ways that the body notices before the mind does. The temperature, as mentioned, stabilizes at a consistent level that is cooler than summer surface air and warmer than winter surface air, a kind of permanent temperate zone that the rock maintains against all seasonal variation. The humidity often rises in limestone environments to levels that make the air feel thick with moisture, laden with the smell of wet stone and deep earth, an olfactory landscape entirely different from anything on the surface. And the light, of course, disappears, not gradually, the way it fades at dusk, but in a way that follows the curve of the passage, so that you walk around a bend and the entrance behind you disappears from view, and the darkness ahead is complete. Complete darkness is another thing that does not happen at the surface, except in the most unusual circumstances. Modern people very rarely experience it. There is almost always some ambient light from streetlights or stars or the glow of screens that prevents the kind of darkness where you cannot see your own hand in front of your face. Underground is different. The darkness of the tunnel in the sections away from the entrance is absolute. Your eyes never adjust because there is nothing to adjust to. No photons reach them. The visual field is blank, and the brain, deprived of the visual information it normally processes at every waking moment, begins to compensate in ways that create their own landscape. The researchers who have worked in the tunnel without artificial light as part of the acoustic and sensory documentation program that Drummond led in the 2015 field season describe a consistent progression of experience. First, the visual field goes completely dark. Then, after some minutes, patterns begin to appear in the darkness, the geometric phosphene patterns that the visual cortex generates when it is deprived of external input. The same patterns documented in altered state experiences and in the geometric motifs found in certain kinds of ancient rock art. Then gradually, the other senses sharpen in compensation. Sound becomes hyperacute. The sensation of air movement against skin becomes vivid. The sense of proprioception, of where one's body is in space, heightens to a degree that most people find surprising, and the acoustic resonance of the tunnel at that heightened level of sensitivity becomes something qualitatively different from what it is when the sensory field is dominated by visual information. At that heightened level of sensitivity, in complete darkness, the 110 hertz resonance of the tunnel is felt in the body as much as heard by the ears. It is a physical vibration present in the sternum and the bones of the skull and the fluid of the inner ear simultaneously. The effect is of being held, lightly but pervasively, by a sound that seems to come from every direction at once and from no direction in particular. The builders understood this. They understood what happens to human perception in the dark, in the specific acoustics of the space they created, and they built the space to produce those effects reliably and with a particular quality of intensity and coherence. And the marked walls, the shaped ceiling, the resonating niches, all of these were tools for producing a specific kind of human experience, and they work as well now as they worked when they were first put in place. This is, again, the embodied cultural transmission that Riverbend's framework was developed to describe. The knowledge the builders had about the effects of darkness and resonance on human perception is encoded in the physical structure of the tunnel, and it transmits itself directly to any human who enters the space in the appropriate conditions. The knowledge does not require a social context for its transmission, because it acts directly on the nervous system that all humans share. That is extraordinary, and it is ordinary in exactly the same way that the arch over the ceiling is both extraordinary in what it represents about the builder's knowledge and ordinary in that it simply does what arches do: distribute weight, keep the ceiling up. The acoustic engineering of the tunnel both represents extraordinary knowledge about human perception and simply does what acoustic engineering does: shape the sound environment to produce specific effects. The knowledge is present in the doing. The doing is self-perpetuating. The tunnel works, and in working, it transmits what it was built to transmit. Anthropologists who study how traditional knowledge systems work have documented a phenomenon that they sometimes call apprenticeship to the environment, which describes the process by which people in certain kinds of societies acquire sophisticated knowledge about the natural world, not primarily through formal instruction, but through extended, attentive, bodily experience of specific environments over long periods of time. The concept is different from what Western educational systems typically mean by learning from experience, which tends to focus on the trial and error acquisition of practical skills. Apprenticeship to the environment goes deeper than that. It describes a process by which the sustained, attentive inhabitation of a specific environment produces a kind of knowledge that is not separable from the bodily experience of the environment itself. Knowledge that is not primarily propositional, not organized in the form of statements that can be detached from the context of their acquisition and transmitted abstractly, but is instead embedded in perceptual skills and bodily capacities and ways of paying attention that have been shaped by long experience in specific places. The indigenous ecological knowledge that ethnobotanists and environmental scientists have documented in communities around the world is largely of this kind. A Secwepemc elder who can identify 300 plant species by sight and smell and taste, and who knows when each of them is edible and what each of them is medicinally useful for, has not acquired that knowledge, primarily by memorizing a list of plant names and properties. She has acquired it by spending decades in the landscape where those plants grow, attending to them through the cycle of seasons, learning them the way you learn the faces of the people you live with, through sustained and attentive presence over time. The tunnels provided a specific kind of environment for this kind of apprenticeship, an environment in which specific faculties of human perception, the faculties associated with interoception and somatic awareness, and the perception of subtle acoustic phenomena, were systematically engaged and developed by the conditions of the space. Extended time in the tunnel for people prepared in the appropriate ways and attending with the appropriate quality of attention would have produced a specific kind of perceptual development that could not have been acquired any other way. That perceptual development was, in the oral tradition's terminology, knowledge. Not knowledge about something external, not information acquired from an external source, but knowledge in the deeper sense of a transformation in the capacity to perceive and understand, the kind of knowledge that changes how you see rather than simply what you see. The tunnel was a school in this sense, an architectural instrument for a specific kind of education. The physical properties of the space were the curriculum, and the human nervous system, brought into sustained contact with those properties in the conditions the builders had designed for, was the student. This interpretation is consistent with what the oral traditions describe, consistent with what the acoustic analysis reveals, consistent with what the researchers who have spent significant time in the space have reported about their own experience. It is the most coherent account of what the tunnels were for that all the available evidence supports. The year 2024 brought a development that nobody on the research team had anticipated, though perhaps they should have. A team of researchers in northern Chile, working with an indigenous community in the Atacama Desert region, announced the discovery of what they were tentatively describing as a subsurface anomaly of possible human origin in a limestone formation in the foothills of the Andes. The anomaly had been identified through a ground-penetrating radar survey conducted as part of an environmental assessment for a proposed solar energy installation in the region. The announcement was made in a press release from the Chilean research team's university, and it was picked up by the same science journalists who had covered the British Columbia findings, and within days it was on the desk of virtually every member of the British Columbia research group. What they saw in the preliminary documentation from Chile was immediately familiar. Not identical, but recognizably similar. The same kind of geometric regularity that had characterized the BC Central Interior Tunnel. The same kind of consistent dimensions. The same depth relative to the surface. Riverbend called the lead researcher in Chile the day the documentation reached him. They spoke for nearly 2 hours. Neither of them said the word network until the very end of the conversation, when the Chilean researcher, a geologist named Dr. Isabel Fuentes, whose field of specialization was karst systems in hyperarid environments, used it herself. She said, "I looked at your papers last night. I looked at Way's corridor analysis. I looked at the 2022 continental position paper, and then I looked at what we found here, and the distance between where we are and where you are, and I thought about the word network." Riverbend asked what she had concluded. She said, "I concluded that the word might not be big enough. The word might not be big enough. Chile is approximately 12,000 kilometers south of British Columbia by surface travel. The two countries are connected by the spine of the Americas, the long chain of mountain ranges and high plateaus that runs from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. The geography that the ancient genomics research has increasingly suggested was a major corridor of human movement and interaction over tens of thousands of years. If the anomaly in Chile is what it appears to be, and if it shares its origin with the anomalies in British Columbia and the other sites across the western corridor of North America, then the network implied by the totality of the evidence is not a regional network. It is a continental one, running the full length of the spine of the Americas from the mountains of the Pacific Northwest to the high desert foothills of the Andes, 10,000 kilometers or more from end to end. Nobody has yet published anything formal about this possibility. The Chile findings are still in the very early stages of investigation, and the research team there is rightly cautious about making claims on the basis of a preliminary radar survey. The British Columbia team has offered to share its methodological framework and to participate in consultation with the Chilean research group and the relevant indigenous communities whose oral traditions about the landscape they inhabit may, like the Sequapemc traditions, contain information about what lies underground. But the conversation has begun. The question is now on the table in a form that cannot be put back down. Is the tunnel system a continental phenomenon? Did the same tradition of underground construction or the same network of underground passages built by connected or related communities extend from British Columbia to Chile? That question, if the evidence eventually supports an affirmative answer, would represent the most significant revision yet of what is already one of the most dramatic revisions in the history of North American archaeology. What would a continental tunnel network mean? It would mean that the pre-contact peoples of the Americas maintained connections across geographic scales that modern observers have struggled to attribute to societies without metal, without wheeled vehicles, without the navigational and communication technologies that enabled the long-distance maritime trade networks of the medieval and early modern periods. It would mean that the organizational capacity implied by the British Columbia tunnels alone was not an isolated regional achievement, but was part of a system of knowledge and organization that extended across the full length of 2 continents. It would mean that the word civilization applied to the pre-contact Americas requires expansion to encompass something that does not have a clear parallel in the history of any other part of the world. A civilization that was expressed primarily underground in the engineering and acoustic design of subsurface spaces, in the management and maintenance of a network of passages connecting communities across an enormous geography, rather than in the temples and palaces and urban landscapes that the word civilization typically evokes. It would mean that we are even further from understanding the full scope of what was here before the colonial period than the most revisionist interpretation of the BC findings alone had suggested, and it would mean that the knowledge held by the indigenous communities of the Americas, from the Sequapemc in British Columbia to the indigenous peoples of the Atacama, is potentially connected to a shared heritage whose scope is only now beginning to become visible. That possibility is still just a possibility. The evidence for a continental network is not yet at the level of certainty that the evidence for the BC tunnel system has achieved after 20 years of careful investigation. The Chile finding is too new, the analysis too preliminary, the cross-referencing with other evidence too incomplete. But the question is there, and once a question like that is there, it does not go away. The last thing, before the silence comes fully in and the story rests in the dark where it belongs. Every person who has ever walked into the central interior tunnel system and stood in the chamber 45 meters below the surface of British Columbia and listened to the resonance of the space has had, in that moment, the same experience. Not the same interpretation, not the same cultural or emotional context, but the same direct, physical, bodily encounter with what the builders put there 12,000 years ago. That is the universality the builders built into the stone. The fact that the experience is available to anyone who enters the space, regardless of their cultural background or their prior knowledge, or the specific language in which they will later try to describe what they felt. The space works on the human body because the space was built for the human body. All human bodies respond to the same acoustic stimuli in the same basic ways. All human nervous systems, in complete darkness with a resonant sound filling the enclosed space, follow the same trajectory of heightened sensitivity and altered perception. The builders knew this because they were themselves human. They built from their own experience of their own bodies, from their accumulated knowledge of how the body responds to specific sensory conditions, from their understanding of what a particular acoustic environment could do to the perception of anyone who entered, it prepared and attentive. They built for everyone who would come after. They built for the researchers who would arrive 12,000 years later with acoustic measuring equipment and peer-reviewed analytical frameworks. They built for the community members who had never stopped coming, whose ceremonial and cultural relationship with the space had maintained its relevance across 12,000 years of world-changing history. They built for the person who will enter the tunnel 100 years from now, and the person who will enter it 1,000 years from now, and however many more generations will come to this place and stand in the dark and feel the stone hear them. They built for you, if you are ever in British Columbia and you have the right relationships and the right permissions and the right preparation and the willingness to go down 45 meters through the mountain and stand in the dark and listen. The tunnel is there. It has always been there. It will be there, in all probability, for a very long time to come, and it is still doing what it was built to do. Sleep now. The mountains of British Columbia are holding what they have always held in the dark and the silence and the 12,000-year patience of stone. The researchers are sleeping somewhere. The community, knowledge holders, are sleeping somewhere. The elders who remember what the tunnels are and the young people who are learning are sleeping. And somewhere in the subsurface of the interior plateau, in the limestone that was shaped by hands whose owners have been gone for 12 millennia, but whose work endures, the resonance still rises when the space is entered with sound. The walls still catch what is spoken and return it changed. The chamber still maintains its specific silence. You carry something of this now, having heard it. You carry the knowledge that there is more beneath the surface than anyone told you, that the history of this continent is longer and richer than the history books described, that the people who were here before left records that outlasted the stone tools they carved them with, encoded in the specific physics of spaces that they built with extraordinary care and extraordinary knowledge. That knowledge is yours now, to do with what you will, to carry into the morning, to share if you find the right moment and the right listener, to let settle into whatever place in your understanding it finds most naturally. And now let the rest of it go. Let the details dissolve into the general warmth of having heard something true and important. Let the names and dates and survey numbers and peer review discussions return to the archive from which they came. What remains is the essential thing. The tunnels are real. The people who built them were real. The knowledge that built them is still alive. And the world that contains them, the world beneath your feet, wherever you are lying right now, is deeper and older and more carefully shaped by human intention than you knew this morning. Rest in that. The stone is patient. The story continues. Good night. End of script. There is one more thing that the research has produced which deserves attention before this telling finds its natural resting place. It is something that emerged not from the tunnel system itself, but from what happened in the years after the investigation became widely known, from the way the knowledge of the tunnels moved through the world above ground once it was no longer solely in the custody of the community that had maintained it and the researchers who had documented it. When knowledge of something this significant enters the public domain, it does not stay the same. It changes as it moves. It accumulates interpretations and associations and emotional resonances that were not part of it in its original form. It gets simplified in some contexts and elaborated in others. It gets connected to other things, some helpfully and some not. It becomes part of people's inner landscapes, their sense of where they come from and what the world is and what humanity has been capable of across the long span of its existence. This is what happened with the BC tunnel findings. They became part of the broader conversation about who we are and what we have built and what we have forgotten and what we might remember. That conversation is ongoing. It is happening in academic papers and in community meetings and in documentary films and in the minds of people who read a news article about the tunnels one afternoon and found that they could not stop thinking about what it meant. What it means is still being worked out. That process will outlast everyone currently participating in it. The full meaning of what is beneath British Columbia will be understood, if it ever is fully understood, by people who have not yet been born, using methods that have not yet been developed, within frameworks of interpretation that have not yet been imagined. That is appropriate. The tunnels are 12,000 years old. Their meaning deserves the time that it will take to unfold. But something can be said now, with confidence, about what the tunnels mean in the most immediate and fundamental sense. They mean that the history of the Americas is longer than we were taught. They mean that the people who inhabited this continent before European arrival were capable of things that the received narrative denied them. They mean that the knowledge held by indigenous communities about their own histories and their own relationships to the landscapes they have inhabited is real knowledge, deserving of the same respect and serious engagement that we give to knowledge produced by any other means. And they mean that the earth beneath our feet, wherever we are, is not an inert substrate on which human history plays out, but a participant in that history shaped by human intention and preserving the record of human achievement in ways that surface archaeology alone cannot fully reveal. Those are things worth knowing. Those are things that change how you stand in the world, once you know them. Once you understand that the history of a place can be vertical as well as horizontal, that the record of human presence extends downward into the ground as well as outward across the landscape, the way you relate to the earth you walk on shifts in a subtle but lasting way. The researchers who have devoted their careers to understanding what is beneath British Columbia have all described something like this shift, a change in how they move through the landscape above the tunnels, a changed sense of the relationship between surface and depth, between what is visible and what is present but not seen, between the thin slice of historical time that modern culture tends to think of as the entirety of history and the enormous depth of time that reaches below, that slice into the geological and prehistorical past, where so much of what made us human actually happened. That shift is available to anyone who hears this story and lets it land in the way that true stories land when they are received with sufficient attention. The story of what is beneath British Columbia is a true story. It is still incomplete, still being developed, still generating new findings and new questions, but the core of it is solid, documented, supported by 2 decades of rigorous investigation conducted in genuine partnership with the communities whose heritage is at stake. And the core of it, received honestly, does something to the imagination that the imagination is grateful for. It opens a door downward, through the floor and into the stone and down to where the vaulted passage runs in the dark and the resonance fills the space, and the walls hold the 12,000-year accumulation of everything that has happened there. It opens a door that once opened cannot be entirely closed again. The door is open now. The tunnel is on the other side of it, and the silence waits, as it has always waited, for whoever is ready to enter. End of script. There is a word in the Secwepemc language that has no direct translation in English. The cultural liaison officer who has worked most closely with the research team over the years has used it in several of the formal consultation meetings, and each time she uses it, the linguists and anthropologists on the team lean forward slightly because the word contains something that the English language does not have a container for. The word, transliterated for the sake of discussion, refers to something like the quality of a place that knows it is being remembered. Not the memory itself, which is a human act, not the place itself, which is a physical fact, but the quality that arises in the relationship between the two, the specific character that a place acquires when it has been held in memory across a very long time by people who care deeply about it. The quality is in the place, but is produced by the memory. The place and the memory are not separate. They constitute each other. The tunnel system in the central interior of British Columbia has this quality. It is a place that has been held in memory for 12,000 years by people who care deeply about it. The caring is in the stone, in the way the stone was shaped and has been maintained. The memory is in the community, in the oral traditions and the ceremonial practices that have kept the knowledge of the tunnel system alive through everything. And the quality that arises in the relationship between the caring in the stone and the memory in the community is something that the English language, which has no word for it, can only gesture toward through description. It is what the researchers feel when they enter the tunnel, It is what the elder described when she said the space felt deeply familiar. It is what makes the silence there different from any other silence, what makes the resonance there different from any other resonance. The place knows it is being remembered. The place knows, in whatever sense a place can know anything, that it has not been forgotten, that across 12,000 years of time the memory of it has been held with care by people who understood what it was for. That knowledge, which is not propositional knowledge and cannot be transmitted in the form of a statement of fact, is part of what the tunnel transmits to anyone who enters it in the right state of attentiveness. It is part of what makes a space worth entering, worth documenting, worth the decades of careful and collaborative research that have been devoted to understanding it. The tunnel knows it is being remembered, and now you know it too. That is enough. That is, perhaps, the most important thing that can be said about what the scientists found in the tunnels beneath British Columbia, and what the world learned when it found out. Something was built there that endures. Something was remembered there that survived. And the knowing of it, spreading outward, now through the slow channels of published research and public conversation, is part of the remembering continuing. Rest in that. The tunnel endures. The memory continues. And the silence holds everything. Good night.